So I would like to welcome you all. I am Tony Stefanidis. I'm the chair of the Geography and Geoinformation Science Department here at Mason, and I'm here to introduce the person who is responsible for that. Burl did an amazing job putting together a tremendous program for the day, and we're very fortunate that he managed to do that for us. And we would like to let you know that we have other events like that. The Geospatial and Geospatial Intelligence program here, we're organizing different talks occasionally. So I would like to welcome you to visit our website where you can find information about that. And of course, Syria is a hot topic. It has been a hot topic for many years. It will continue being a hot topic for many more years. I would like to, pass the baton over to Burl. Burl, an amazing program.
Thank you, Tony. Welcome to our seminar. And it is organized as a seminar, not a workshop. So question and answers, discussions, very important. Also, we have ample time for networking for people who get to know each other, and also to meet the presenters. But we'll also have breaks, so I encourage you to interact with our presenters, who I'm going to introduce now. The purpose of this seminar in my classes, World Regional Geography, Local Geography, and North Africa and Southwest Asia, Middle East Geography, this was an issue that came up in several discussions and an area of my interest as well. So I thought it would be good for my students, I have 183 of them, those who were interested, to sit down on a Saturday and discuss in detail and hear from experts on the Syrian Holocaust. And so that's the first purpose. Equally as important are public school faculty being invited to this program, and the involvement of the Virginia Geographic Alliance, which really made the financing and the marketing of this particular seminar very important, especially to public school educators. And so I will also encourage those faculty from area school districts, based on those that said they would be here, 17 different area school districts, to get to know our campus, if you don't already know it, and our programs. So we have a lot going on here, and it would serve as an excellent resource in terms of lecture materials and education materials for the public school system. We have several very distinguished presenters. The idea of the Syrian Holocaust, I wanted to look at the major players, so the United States, Israel, Russia. So we have, for example, General Michael Hayden, who is a distinguished professor of intelligence studies at George Mason University. General Hayden is former Central Intelligence Agency director, former National Security Agency director, and is also very versed in terms of U.S. strategic interest in this area. And I might add that he's going to address that very issue. The Middle East is the connecting tissue of three continents, Europe, Africa, and Asia. The United States cannot advance our strategic interests in either Europe, Africa, or Asia without being involved in the Middle East. So don't look for a withdrawal anytime soon from this area. It's an extremely important area. Secondly, we have the Colonel Rob Rob Friedenberg. Colonel Friedenberg is the Levant Division Chief for Joint Chiefs, and he's also a Middle East area officer. So he is both fluent in Arabic and very skilled in terms of his experience in dealing with these issues that we'll be discussing today. Colonel Kevin Culhane. Dr. Culhane is a retired former Defense Intelligence Agency human intelligence trainer. He was also J2X, which is the civilian in charge of all intelligence operations for Afghanistan. And Kevin is a Russian area officer, and he has a great deal of experience both in Russia and Central Asia. He will look at the geopolitical behavior of Russia in this particular area. Dan Van Gundy, also a retired Defense Intelligence Agency. Colonel Van Gundy is a Russian area officer, and he is many years in the Special Forces. Both he and Kevin had multiple tours combat tours in Vietnam. They're both airborne rangers, so they understand conflict. So they've been involved in conflict for over a long period of time. And Dan is going to discuss Syria and Russia and the geopolitical context of Syria. Danny Chwawi. Danny is an expert on Syrian politics, and he will address the Syrian incumbent government and the major players in the Syrian incumbent government. Rob is going to address the issues that caused the Syrian uprising and the major players. He was our last defense attaché for the embassy in Damascus, so he has a lot of first-hand knowledge. Zahra Mirza is Zahra. There, Zahra. Zahra understands Saudi politics. She is a Meccan. Her father is a professor of geography at Harvard University, and Zahra also has been to several training programs at both Yale and Harvard. And she's going to discuss Saudi interest in Syria. So when we look at Iran, Colonel Brent Riederhoff is a former deputy G3, Weapons of Mass Destruction, WMD, for the Joint Chiefs. And he understands nuclear weapons, he understands geopolitical issues involving nuclear weapons, and he also understands Iran. So he is going to discuss Iran. So we have, I think, expert testimony: Iran, Syria, Saudi Arabia, Israel, and our strategic interest in the region. So it should be a very, very productive day. As these presentations become available, then I will post them on the Geography website, and you can download them. Feel free to record all the presentations today, however. But until then, I will eventually get them all up and posted, and Ron will take care of that. Ron Mahabir. Ron, raise your hand. Ron Mahabir is in charge of the GIS exercise beginning this afternoon. So those of you who would like to participate will move to the second floor, and there we'll go through a rather quick but intensive GIS tutorial where you can generate maps on Syria and take those home with you. So administrative questions, plenty of food, so feel free throughout the day. The women's restroom is that direction, about 10 meters, and the men's restroom is that direction, about 10 meters. And lunch will be on the Virginia Geographic Alliance at the Southside Dining, and we'll go as a group, and we will go to the right, and Southside Dining is only about 100 meters walk, so very, very close. It's excellent food, 7 different islands, all you can eat, so by and large, if you want your big meal of the day to be lunch, then you have an ample opportunity. I'm going to change the schedule of presenters a little. I'd like to introduce Michael Hayden. General Hayden, former NSA and CIA director, will present on Syria, Israel, and U.S. strategic interest in Syria. General Hayden.
Thank you, and Burl, I'll rely on you to shot clock and let me know when
Okay.
time is up. And I'd also like to leave some space for questions.
That's right, because General Hayden has to go, so we will, instead of at the end of the day, General Hayden will take questions at the end of this presentation.
So I'll try to be efficient. So Burl has kind of tagged me with describing American interest in this part of the world. I think I've got the most difficult job of all your presenters, because I frankly kind of look at what we're doing and say, now, what motivated that? Why are we doing that? Burl says, I was director of NSA and then CIA 06 to 09, so the back half of the second Bush term. We talked about Syria a lot. And you know, in human discourse, lots of different points of light come up in a discussion. And it's the academic or the historian or the deep thinker like a Brzezinski or a Scowcroft or Kissinger then takes those almost tactical considerations and takes those points of light and organizes them into a bit of a constellation and say, you know, what you're really talking about here is, and that is the strategic interest. For Syria, it's really been a bit of a movable feast. It's that, you know, how those points of light of that constant conversation, really. But what it was you were talking about really shifted, even in those 2 or 3 years. So let me just give you a couple of examples as to how we Americans are trying to define our interests there. The going in position, my first kind of hugging the problem was Arab-Israeli. All right? It was all about Palestine. It was all about the dividing line between the Jewish state and its Arab neighbors. If you look at the map in the top right-hand corner of Israel, you got the Golan Heights up there. I was up on the Golan with my Israeli counterpart in 2000, and the idea was, if you guys give up some geography here, and if you look at the Golan, you can see Damascus from the Golan. All right, it's kind of a gray, concrete, powdery cloud, but you know that's a city. And obviously, given what intelligence organizations do, that's probably prime real estate. And so the thought was, we're inching towards an agreement. You know, kind of a la the Egyptian-Syrian peace agreement, the Jordanian, the Egyptian-Israeli peace agreement, the Jordanian-Israeli understanding. And so what would it take in terms of return of territory? And so, you know, I was kind of the point guy saying, all right, so that's what the geography gives you in terms of warning time here. How can I reconstruct that warning time for you using technical means rather than the geography that you may be required to give up in order to get the deal? Okay. Then Hafiz dies. Okay, just dies not too long after that. Bashar's dad. That just doesn't go anywhere. But the point I want to make is, all that conversation is about the Arab-Israelis. The next time I enter the conversation, that was when I was NSA. The next time I enter it, I'm in CIA, and the whole point of the conversation is the war on terror. The whole discussion is, how can you more get the Syrians on side with regard to the global war on terror, and specifically with the rat lines of foreign fighters. I mean, we're routinely taking commercial flights to Damascus, linking up with cells in Syria, getting driven out to the Iraqi border, crossing over into Anbar province, and off they go. So now, you know, the organizing principle of all those points of light are, how can I get the Syrians to kind of squeeze that pipeline? How can I get the Syrians to be our friends, or at least our accomplices in the global war against terrorism, and specifically feeding the Iraqi insurrection? There you go. Thank you. We actually made friends with Bashar's brother-in-law, Asif Shakat, married to his sister. He was killed in a suicide bombing. He was not an easy partner. It was not a great partnership. To be fair, we were not a very good partner for him. I mean, there were inherent distrust and so on. And frankly, it didn't work out very well. And by the time I was done being director, we were done cooperating. It just didn't work. But that's okay. I'm just telling you, the point was, we were looking at Syria, in terms of the global war on terror, not much discussion about Arab-Israeli. In the Bush administration, people ask me, so what did you guys talk about in the Oval Office? And I'd say, well, you know, let me give you a rank order. Number 1 was terrorism. Number 2 was Iran. There was no number 3. That didn't mean we didn't talk about other stuff. What I'm saying is we didn't aggregate around anything enough that I could say there's number 3. And so Syria very often came up in the discussion, not just as part of the rat line going into Iraq, but as the only true Arab ally of the Persians, of the Iranians. And we had endless discussions. And the phrase we would use, can we flip aside? Can we flip aside? I mean, the class, you know, you read Metternich, you read Kissinger, you know, if you're going after an alliance of a very dominant state with a satellite state in the true meaning of the word, controlled by the gravitational pull of the bigger state. I mean, the classic diplomatic ploy is to try to hive off the weaker state. Is to take the weaker state and offer them a better deal. So we continue to talk about Iran and Syria in that context, and now you realize, okay, I moved a bit beyond terrorism, and certainly beyond the Arab, I mean, all connected, I got it. But beyond terrorism and beyond the Arab-Israeli dispute, and this is all now about the Sunni-Shia split. And the powerful lens, the lens through which we defined our interests, which is what I want to talk about here, the lens through which we defined our interests was through Tehran. And what we could do in Syria to affect the far more important relationship or lack of relationship we had with the Iranians in the competition between the Shia, represented by Iran, and the Sunnis in the Gulf and elsewhere. And so, you know, how you define our interests is somewhat dependent upon almost external circumstances. We went from this to being a lens in Arab-Israeli, to being a lens on stopping the flow of terrorists, to being a lens in the broader competition between Iran and Sunni states, between Iran and the United States. Okay, that's kind of point 1. What our definition of interest had been kind of a movable feast. By the way, if you listen carefully to what I said, none of those 3 models put Syria at the core of what we're doing. Syria was or was not in service of some other bigger thing. All right? It was terrorism, the Arab-Israeli dispute, or the dispute with Iran. It was never Syria as Syria, which you might want to give some thought, maybe even in your discussion periods later, you might want to think whether that was a really good idea. Syria was always a tool, never the object in all these discussions. Then, you know, you get the Arab awakening, the war fruit merchant self-immolates in Tunisia, you get 1 million people on Tahrir Square, and then you start getting echoes of that in Syria, south of Damascus, Dara. Demonstrations grow. Demonstrations are terribly mishandled by the government. Rob and I were talking about this, misidentified perhaps by the government, misunderstood by the government in terms of what it really was, and now here we are. Let me talk, again, it's about lenses, all right? Let me talk about the lenses through which I think our government has been looking at the current conflict. As intelligence officers, it's really useful to get the facts straight. And if you don't get the facts straight, then you're not in the game. So we got the facts wrong, like that Iraqi weapons of mass destruction estimate thing. Remember, we just got that wrong. But beyond that, it's not sufficient to just get the facts right. You've got to marshal the facts in a narrative in order to explain reality to a policymaker. Now, this is not intelligence cooking the books. It's intelligence selecting to the policymaker that you've got multiple narratives going on here right now. Let me tell you what I believe to be the dominant narrative with regard to how you should make a decision. I'm sorry, that's obscure. walk you through it in a very, 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 very concrete way. Our view of this war, talking about the insurrection inside Syria, is through the lens of cell phone videos. I mean, our first embrace of this is watching this almost constantly. Well, you were still there before we closed the embassy, but back home, I mean, you're seeing it maybe in widescreen because you're looking out the windscreen of your vehicle. But back here, it's through the cell phone video. And what we are seeing, and this is true, I'm not saying this is distorted, this is a true reality, we were essentially seeing autocrats against Democrats. We were seeing a humanitarian catastrophe developing as the autocrats used all the tools at their disposal to try to suppress the Democrats. And that autocrat-Democrat thing is true, was true, remains true. But that's not the only way to line up the data. By the way, I'm watching this thing as a guy out of government with a little bit of background knowledge, and I'm looking at the cell phone video and seeing dispatches from reporters there, and I'm saying, yeah, what you got here is a humanitarian crisis, disaster waiting to happen, and you got autocrats acting very badly towards Democrats. And by the way, if that's your lens, there is a certain instinct for you now as a policymaker. It kind of tilts you in the direction of a decision, which is, this is a humanitarian disaster. I wonder if I could do anything to help. I don't have to do everything to help. That's not required. It's a humanitarian, it's almost like a charitable decision. You know, how much am I going to give to the combined federal campaign here because it's just a good thing to do? But there's not real compellence. So that was the first storyline. Quickly, to my eye, and I suspect to the Colonel's eye as well, continuing to be autocrat versus Democrat, this became a sectarian war. With 11% of the population, the Alawites, continuing to try to control the 60% of the population, the Sunnis, who were in the streets, demonstrating, shading occasionally to violence in response to government violence. By the way, if you did the math, you said 11% versus 60, coming up 29% short. And those are Christians, Druze, and Kurds. By and large, are still sitting in the general admission seats, not coming out on the field. And frankly, when they're picking their seats, although they're not on the field, when they're picking their seats, they're picking them pretty much behind the home team, which is Assad, because he's the devil they know. And there's a certain fear as to what happens if the Sunni opposition comes into power. So me, my background, okay, humanitarian crisis, well, you might want to get some thought, you're not overly committed, certainly I'm not going to conduct a ground war about this, but maybe we ought to go do something to help the Democrats. Oh, wait, that's a sectarian war. Oh, yeah, I see it now. I got those T-shirts. I actually got 2 of them. They don't end up well. I know how this story goes. Sectarian war, no way, I'm not going there. By the way, it remained a humanitarian crisis. It was a sectarian war. The longer it went on, it became less Syrian and more regional. The longer it went on, it became more defined by who was helping whom. And what you had were the Alawites, an offshoot of Shiism, being supported by the Iranians, the center of the universe for Shia power, and Hezbollah. And you had the opposition, largely Sunni, picking up support from the Turks and from Qatar, Jordanians, and particularly the Saudis. I mean, the Saudis proved their seriousness by putting Bandar bin Sultan in charge of the war. I'm seeing some nods up. You know Prince Bandar? Yeah. Former ambassador to the United States for just about forever. Trained as an American fighter pilot, F-15 pilot. Plays Americans like a drum. All right. A little erratic, perhaps back home. His Majesty King Abdullah, Bandar's in, Bandar's out. They give Bandar the portfolio for raising hell in Syria against the Alawites of Bashar al-Assad, in support of the Sunnis. So now I'm watching this and go, oh, yeah, it's a humanitarian thing. Yeah, it's kind of a sectarian thing. But now it's a regional thing. And the regional thing is that massive Sunni Shia split. And here, since I've already kind of suggested to you, one of the big problems we had in the White House and continue to have in the White House was Iran, and where is Iran going, and can you put a cap on their nuclear program, and so on. Now, whereas it's a sectarian war, I'm not touching that sucker. Now, if it's a Sunni Shia thing, and by and large the Sunnis are kind of our friends, and by and large the Shias are kind of not, then you might want to, take that little thumb here and start putting it on the scale and doing things in favor of the Sunnis in order to suck up Iranian power and drain the Iranians and Hezbollah of their strength in this war. So now, if your main plot line is this is fundamentally now a Sunni-Shia war, and it's no longer a local Syrian war, it's a regional conflict, then your instincts are, well, maybe we want to play here. Maybe we want to put some chips on this war. By the way, it's still a sectarian war, and it's still a humanitarian crisis. The fourth plot line is much shorter, but it was quite interesting. In its own quite odd way, this thing became one of those east-west things, which people of a certain age in the audience, not most of you, can remember, where everything was defined as zero-sum between the Soviet Union and the United States. And you got the Soviets maneuvering in one direction, our maneuvering in another direction. I'm not going to rehearse that dotted pink red line thing we had. And in any event, a fourth plot line was this became in a really weird way, kind of an expression of East-West competition. I don't think it's a very dominant plot line. We'll skip over that. And then finally, the fifth plot line that evolved, and I think, and the Colonel here suggested it may have happened a little bit earlier than I have traditionally thought. By about late spring 2012, to my mind, all those other plot lines, still true, still going on, were a bit suppressed in their dominance for the fifth plot line. And I think this plot line I'm telling you now is the one that's affecting the American government. The fifth plot line is left to its own dynamics. This conflict is on a trajectory to create a Sunni stand comprised of Anbar province in Iraq and the eastern Syrian desert. A Sunni stand that will be dominated by the increasingly fundamentalist elements of the Syrian opposition. And we will end up with an al-Qaeda safe haven that physically resembles the safe haven they had in the tribal region of Pakistan, or even the safe haven they had in Afghanistan prior to 9/11. Except, unlike Afghanistan, it won't be in the middle of nowhere. It's going to be in the middle of the Middle East. And you will have a Sunni fundamentalist al-Qaeda safe haven within 150 miles of Beirut, Damascus, and Jerusalem. And to my mind, that's the dominant plot line now. That's the organization of these multiple points of light that you can combine and move in different patterns. That's the constellation that now has become the American definition of its self-interest in this war. We could end up with the disintegration of Syria and one of the successor states, de jure or de facto, being a fundamentalist Sunni state in a very, very difficult part of the world. I actually think my personal understanding of the narrative, the way I thought about it, my personal understanding of the narrative is that became my dominant narrative in late spring to early summer in 2012. Okay. 2012 was a leap year. 2012 was the year of the Summer Olympics. And 2012 was the year of an American presidential election, where we don't allow ourselves to make any serious decisions with regard to foreign policy. So that plot line became more and more dominant. We were frozen into inaction because of our presidential campaign. And then we wake up in the second Obama administration in the spring of 2013 with a very bad situation, and now forced to question, so what do we do about it? I think that's where we are in terms of American self-definition of American self-interest here. I had one other thought, and then I'll take questions. This is going to sound judgmental because it's judgmental. I think the North Star of American involvement in the Syrian conflict has been to minimize, at all costs, in any way possible, American involvement. Okay? And I think that was a contributory factor to the walking of the narratives between humanitarian, sectarian, now we are where we are. You see the president making noises about, I need some ideas, I want to rethink this. Secretary Kerry always seems to be about a beat and a half off the script that they're saying from the White House. Secretary Kerry is trying to push a more robust American role. I've actually said this publicly, and because of it, I've been quoted extensively in the Iranian and Russian press services. So you can get a sense of how happy I am with that. I've said, given what it is we're doing, or frankly what we're not doing, of the possible outcomes I now see in Syria, possible, not desirable, possible outcomes I see in Syria, the one that looks the best to me right now is Bashar al-Assad wins. Because the other two, which is nobody wins, and we have what DNI Jim Clapper calls an apocalyptic disaster, continues. Or the other alternative is the opposition wins. I already told you my great fear of a Sunni stand where money exists. So much for definition. Oh, wait, one more. The Israelis, they want Hafez al-Assad back. They liked him. They liked to put electrodes on him, get him out of the grave, and take over from his son. I mean, I talk to Israelis about this a lot. They just want this to be a stable, autocratic state, making decisions based upon a cold calculation of self-interest. Okay? And if they got that, they're good to go. They're not going to cause trouble for the Israelis. Sorry.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Questions?
Do you think if the increasing numbers of refugees going into Turkey along the border, and if the Islamist terrorists form their quasi-state in Syria, will that destabilize Turkey enough that they'll get involved?
Yeah, and actually, I was in Accra last week. All right, and actually, I have a chance to talk to a lot of people in the others. There are a lot of things going on in Turkey. The Syrian refugee flow right now is not at the top of the list. It's goodness, corruption, and who controls the internet, and so on. But it is kind of a neuralgic issue. I actually think it's far more threatening to Jordan than it is to Turkey right now. And I should have mentioned that that's another aspect of the current situation, is that the bleed over is destabilizing other states. 1 in 4 human beings in Lebanon right now is a Syrian. So you see the effects. But again, that really hasn't, I mean, seriously, that really hasn't budged us off of our kind of don't get involved.
Question. Do you think there's, do you know why, from an intelligence standpoint, or have an idea why the Saudis, they handed the Syrian file from Bandar bin Sultan to the Minister of Interior?
To Mohammed bin Naif?
Yeah. Is it just to, do you think it's just to strengthen the moderate opposition, or is it to weaken the radical opposition? And do you think that it'll help the moderate opposition obtain weapons?
Yeah,
it's very hard.
Yeah, the question is why would the Saudis transfer the Syrian portfolio between Bandar bin Sultan and Mohammed bin Naif? Have you met either of the men?
I haven't done enough.
If you have, you wouldn't ask the question. Mohammed is competent beyond understanding. He was the head of Saudi Mabahith when the Al-Qaeda went after the Western housing compounds in 2003, kind of breaking the tacit ceasefire. His Majesty King Abdullah said, Muhammad, that can't happen. Yes, Your Majesty. Never happened again. I mean, in a very Saudi way, Al-Qaeda is decimated inside the kingdom. Before you think he's just, kind of an inhuman Cossack-like warrior or something, he also created the only really workable rehabilitation program for jihadists that exists in the world today. He's a very educated man, right? His dad died. He's Mohammed bin Naif. Prince Naif died, Minister of the Interior, and the king elevated him. So he's now Minister of the Interior. Clearly the king thinks the world of him. He could be king one day, I think. Bandar, on the other hand, is in and out of the king's doghouse. Right? I love Prince Bandar. Just a great guy to be with. But he's no caffeine, ever. And he was a bit, my view now, a bit reckless with the Syrian portfolio. And now, as remember, we're kind of shifting, oh man, this is going to end up in a Sunnistan state that's going to threaten everything. We're trying to play a little bit more here in influencing who gets what, who gets the kit. I think it's hard for us to control the guttery contribution. I think that's kind of off the reservation and is feeding radical opposition. I think we thought we had a better chance of influencing the Saudi contribution, and the king putting Mohammed in charge of it, whom any American who works this problem knows and views to be a friend, is the king's way of saying, okay, we're going to be more careful who gets our kid, and we'll work with you to decide that. So it's a very positive sign, and probably a sign to us more than anywhere else. Yep.
Do you think the Russians are willing to keep control of their naval base in Syria at any cost, regardless of how bad Syria gets?
Yeah. Questions about the Russian naval base and at what cost? Naval base is a really expansive term for what this is. I think this is one repair ship and a refueling station, right? Yeah. I mean, we're thinking Pearl Harbor here, okay, or maybe Hampton Roads, and they got one rusted repair ship, and they got the right to get fuel from the port of Tartus. So it's not that big a deal for them. And so no, this is not life or death for them. Those ports in the Crimea, different. They'll go for those, but not this. Any others for me?
One more question.
Oh, we got 3. Okay.
How much do we know about ISIS?
I actually think we know more than we kind of let on. I know my old guys at the agency are working this very, very hard. They actually express some degree of confidence. We know personalities now and have a certain level of understanding. I mean, it's not a God's eye view. We're not omniscient, but I do think we've got we're okay. We know who they are, and we know enough to make judgments. There are a couple other hands up. Yes, sir.
You comment on what's your view on the attack on Damascus actually being more of an assertion of dominance, seeing that the Sunnis basically, as you said, they have a greater fraction of the Muslim population, the Arabic population, or do you think it was more of an overestimation of force rather than a strategized assertion of dominance?
No, I'm not saying. Give me the front end of the question again.
Basically, one of the theories that I've read that because President Assad, Muslim fraction, they basically have less domination, or they don't they don't dominate the population.
Oh no, yeah, no, they're 11%.
Right. So, do you think the attack on Damascus was it basically to assert dominance, to tell people that, look, we got, if anything goes wrong here, we could basically.
And we see the attack on Damascus. You're talking about the chemical weapons attack?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. I believe what I read, and American intelligence was very forward-leaning. It said some things in that white paper they issued about we intercepted senior Syrian leaders. That's very odd for us to actually admit to intercepting a communication. In that statement, for anyone in Syria, it's too too short off to say that was me on that phone with that frequency. So I mean, you're actually putting sources and methods very much at risk. But it was very important for us to identify who did it. So I don't think it was a rogue unit. I think it was carefully calculated. The Alawites are infantry poor and firepower heavy. And that puts them in a really difficult position. You think back to the war in Bosnia, it's exactly the description of the Bosnian Serbs. Infantry poor and indirect fire heavy. That generally leads to using your indirect fire weapons, which are consistently less precise than closing with and destroying an enemy, which you can do with infantry. And so they're a bit in extremis in a tactical way, not a strategic way, I think. In a tactical way in the suburbs of Damascus, and they just stopped. Yeah, let's just use really high end of our firepower chemical weapons. It'll be a demonstration, and we'll clear these neighborhoods that seem to be a continual neuralgic threat to our lives. And, you know, you need to keep in mind that we got in this rut in Bosnia back in the 90s. Serbs were all powerful, and we're not. They had some strengths. They didn't have infantry. They couldn't follow up on their success. The Alawites are kind of like that. They're infantry-like. Therefore, what do? Barrel bombs. Which remains immoral. But for somebody in my profession, you know, you kind of sympathize with people in tactical circumstances for which they only have a limited number of tools.
I have a question about the Syrian region, and I was wondering how the Kurds would feel about that, and how the U.S. interest then would.
Yeah. So we already got kind of a Kurdish state up and running in the Kurdish autonomous region in northern Iraq. Kurds are the largest ethnic group on the planet without country. Yeah, thanks. This could be a good way of ending this. Okay, I'm going to answer this, but it's going to be a 3-carom shot. All right. See that, Matt? So I was going to go on TV on Meet the Press on Sunday morning. The weekend we were going to go to war in Syria. Remember, John Kerry went out there Friday afternoon and gave that speech. You remember that speech? I've seen some people nodding. Yeah. So I'm at home. We live in McLean. I'm at home. We're washing windows for the first time in 5 years. So my wife is not letting me out. So I said, okay, I'm here, but we got to be in a room with a wide screen, cleaning windows when that speech is on, because I want to watch this speech. So I watched the speech, get all done. She says, so what'd you think? I said, well, it's a very interesting speech. I do wish I was downtown today, though. I think there was a coup. Okay. That was a presidential speech. That was a presidential, we're going to war speech. And then the guy who's really president takes a walk on the South Lawn with Dennis McDonough as chief of staff. He says, yeah, Dennis, I've been thinking. And then they call it off, remember? Well, I'm scheduled to go and Meet the Press on Sunday. David Gregory. I think I'm going to go on with Barry McCaffrey. Okay. And retired Army Force Leader. Because it's, you know, we're going to be at war. Get the intel guy, get the operator guy here. Let's do the thing. Now, they never tell you what they're going to ask you. But you kind of get a broad topical area. And you get a little sense of the sequence. And what they were going to do, and that's why we're here at this point, they were going to get us up from the table, and David Gregory, well, generals, let's go to the map. You know, walk to the map. Okay, so I knew they were going to take us to the map. So I'm saying, okay, what do I, by the way, we got, as soon as the president made his speech, they got a call up, you're off the air, you're not coming tomorrow. Okay, because now it was all political, not military, and they wanted a congressman to argue about this. What I had rehearsed, when I got to that map, and David Gregory said, well, General, what can you tell us about this map? I said, well, David, let me give you my first impression. Don't get used to it. I actually think what is going on here, and part of the engine here is the redefinition of the real fault line in the region to be Sunni Shia rather than Arab Israeli. Okay? It really is. I'd go to Saudi Arabia, get an audience with His Majesty Abdullah. I'd get about 3 to 5 minutes on the Palestinians. You can just see his mind going, check, Phil, that's where. Now, the next 55 minutes were about the Iranians. And he would begin by calling them the Iranians. Then he really got warmed up, and it was the Persians. And then it was really hot, it was the Shia. Okay, so that's the fault line. All those lines there are the product of European diplomats writing lines in the Arab world for European convenience. Those are all artificial states. None of them have their own history. Egypt's got a history. Tunisia's got a history. Okay? Lebanon, artificial. Syria, artificial. Iraq, artificial. Libya, artificial. Now, we had lines drawn in other parts of the world at the same time. These are Sykes-Picot. But these are all post-Versailles lines. We had post-Versailles lines drawn in Europe, too. Created states like Czechoslovakia. Created states like Yugoslavia. Just allowed the creation of the Soviet Union. They're all gone. I mean, the thing going on in Ukraine right now is trying to settle a rounding error in what constitutes the Russian Federation. I mean, fundamentally, that's really what we're doing. We're just kind of cleaning up the lines, because these lines are going away. Thereby giving the Kurds, who were divided into 3 states, giving the Kurds an opportunity, perhaps, to create their own. But again, I firmly believe that those artificial lines drawn for European convenience, non-reflective of ethnic, historic, and religious realities on the ground, will not survive the Arab awakening. They survived for 100 years because of Western imperial power, followed by the flash freezing of all lines during the Cold War, followed by being kept in place by the power of Arab autocrats. X. All 3 of those things are gone. The cork's out of the bottle. Somebody had already shaken it up. And the lines are going to change. And so you could really end up with something more than just the Kurdish autonomous region.
In your discussion, you said that Iran was from the main discussion.
Right.
How do you feel that if it has their Iranian power has either gained or weakened through this conflict?
You could make an argument that, and this is choosing to ignore all moral dimensions. Right? Just put all morality aside. You can make the argument that a continued humanitarian catastrophe that has fanatical Shia killing fanatical Sunnis and vice versa for a long period of time was peculiarly well suited to serve American interests. And again, you'd have to close your eyes to all sorts of horrific human suffering. And so this could be an energy sink for the Iranians and for Hezbollah. Colonel probably knows more about this than me, and I invite you to ask him the question. I was surprised Nasrallah doubled down as much as he did and pushed Hezbollah fighters, which then helps solve the infantry problem for Assad by giving him Hezbollah foot soldiers. I've got the highest regard for Nasrallah's intellect, and he must have felt this was really an existential problem for him to go ahead. I mean, Hezbollah has been trying to be the Corleone family and Godfather 3 now for about 15 years. You know, we used to do that, but we don't do that anymore. We're a social services organization, we're a political party, and then he flies in the face of that and drops a couple thousand fighters in the war. So, if they win, okay, if Assad wins, you solidify the Shia arc in a way that's never been that way before. If they lose, it fractures it. That's the flipping Assad gambit we toyed with in the Bush administration. And if it continues just the way it is now, it really does suck energy from the Iranians and their allies. Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of your summer.
stable Syria is far more valuable than a destabilized Syria. The great arc of the Shia and Shia rising, which is an interesting concept which we discussed in class. If you look at estimates of the total Muslim population in the world, over 1 billion people, estimated 85% consider themselves to be Orthodox, Sunni. About 14 to 15%, thereabouts, depending on your source, Shia, or one of the various Shia orders. But interestingly, 90% of all the Shia in the world are in Iran. And the majority of the population of Iraq are Shia. And when you look at the political movements and the national movements in those two political geographies, they have a great deal of sympathy and support for Syria. And then you include Hezbollah in Lebanon, which is the most well-prepared and well-armed military entity, at least in southern Lebanon, if not in all of Lebanon. So there you have a combination of resources that are available to Assad that, by and large, mitigate against significant Western military actions. When you look at the attacker-defender ratios, it's really kind of a standoff between Assad's forces and the Sunni forces. But you look at the force multipliers of an insurgency: media, technology, transnational support, and religion. And you look at all four of those that play in Syria. But the insurgent movement lacks significant military assets, really, to combat Assad's forces. The game changers, in my view, will be the SA-300 system, which the Soviets or the Russians have sold to Syria, and they've trained numerous Syrian operators. That's probably one of the best anti-aircraft missile systems in the world. Israeli has so far stopped the transfer, I guess, in part, of some SA-300 systems by attacking those convoys before they enter Lebanon. The last one was in the Bekaa Valley. The Bekaa Valley is a geopolitically strategic location from Damascus to Beirut. You have to go through the anti-Lebanon mountains, where nobody really lives, and then Mount Lebanon, where the majority of the population lives. So that's a topographical gap. And that's where Israel has caught Hezbollah convoys ferrying the SA-300 systems into Lebanon. The other game changer will be the military technology that Syria is giving to Iran and also Syria, that Russia is giving to Syria and also Iran. And one of those, I talked to an Israeli tank commander from the 2006 war in southern Lebanon. They lost 50 Merkava tanks. 50. The majority of their casualties were tank crews, not infantry. So the wrong weapon and the wrong physical geography, for those of you who've seen southern Lebanon. So the Russian cornet will unzip, will destroy a Merkava, penetrates 1 meter homogeneous steel. And I talked to one of the veterans of the Iraq War, staff sergeant, and we did have an Abrams destroyed, although the Pentagon denies that any M1A2 was destroyed or catastrophically failed in Iraq. There was, in fact, an M1A2 hit with a Coronet missile and destroyed in Iraq. But after that, more than likely, Iran withdrew support for providing more Coronets because Iran's address on that kind of weapon begs for U.S. intervention in Iran. Any further questions? We're a little bit behind, but that's okay. It's a seminar. So anybody have any comments? All right, my turn. So I want to go through a PowerPoint rather quickly. A lot of the points that General Hayden made, I've made in my point. And my presentation is U.S. strategic interest in this region. Why are we really interested in the Middle East? So bear with me here just a moment. And maybe I can get this going. You want to take a break? Take a break. Back and forth. Okay. very difficult system. Okay. Probably did away with that. Okay. First of all, I mentioned centrality. We cannot really advance our strategic interest in North Africa and Southwest Asia without being involved in the Middle East, and there are several reasons for that. And one of them is energy. So when I look at some of the critical locations in this area, every president since George Bush Sr. has stated publicly that they will not allow the Straits of Hormuz to be closed. The United States, the second most powerful military entity in the world, is a carrier strike group. We have one in the Arabian Gulf, one in the Indian Ocean, and one in the Mediterranean Sea. 3 carrier strike groups. That's significant. So there's no question that the United States would commit significant military assets to prevent the Hormuz Straits being closed. 90% of all the seaborne oil in the entire region transits the Straits. 90%. If I drew a line at the head of the Arabian Gulf, I refuse to use the term Persian Gulf until Iran apologizes to my country for overrunning our embassy. But if I drew a circle at the head of the Arabian Gulf, 500 by 800 miles, that would capture 80% of all the oil in the entire North African and Southwest Asian region. Your conclusion that most of the countries of the so-called Middle East either have no oil or they have very little. And 64% of the world's proved reserves of oil are found in the Arabian Gulf. And the pipelines emanating from the Gulf to the Mediterranean or to the Red Sea are minimal in terms of transporting oil to world markets. The Hormuz Straits, 90%. Close the Hormuz Straits or generate conflict in the Hormuz Straits, and we're looking at overnight $5 a gallon gasoline. And historically, I know this for a fact, 3 years ago, that Pentagon planners viewed $10 a gallon in gasoline as a point of significant American civil unrest. Gasoline got to that particular price, so obviously we couldn't really fulfill our daily economic responsibilities. So this is a good example, the Hormuz Straits, of why we have significant strategic interests in this geographic area. In 1948 was the last year that the United States could depend, on its own domestic sources of petroleum. That was the last year, 1948, before any of you were born. When you look at this area and Central Asian oil and gas field, it becomes even more important. and especially because Central Asian oil and gas, the pipelines emanating from this area by U.S. diplomatic efforts in part terminate in Turkey, our ally. But the goal, or the preferred termini for these pipelines, Iran, which the United States definitely opposes. So Caspian Basin, look at the proximity of Russia, Iran, Iraq, and Syria. There may be as much oil in the Caspian Basin as there is in the Arabian Gulf. So Central Asian geopolitics, and combined with our interest in the Middle East, definitely argue for U.S. presence, both political, economic, and military, in this area for quite some time. And Turkey, of course, is a geopolitical pivot of U.S. Central Asian policy. Turkey is an avowed enemy of Syrian, Iraqi, and Iranian, and Kurdish nationalism. Turkey is the largest and most powerful military entity in the entire region. Member of NATO. NATO was not designed for confrontation with the Soviet Union. Myth. NATO was designed for Turkey. And when NATO was formed, that was publicly announced. Once Turkey became a member of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, the Soviet Union was locked up. They were isolated. And their only significant exit into international commerce in the world would be through our close ally, Turkey, and the Turkish Straits, the Bosporus, the world's busiest seaway today, and the Dardanelles. Arabian Gulf, oil. This is the world's largest oil field. The Ghawar field, 250 miles wide, 300 miles long. Note that the majority of the oil fields and the largest gas fields are offshore. So the Arabian Gulf, offshore political geography, is a major concern, especially between Saudi Arabia and Iran, and access to these major oil fields. Saudi Arabia has 7 fields about that same size. They've only used 2 of them to any great extent. Saudi Arabia is our ally. Saudi Arabia in the past has threatened OPEC, Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, to double the price, double their capacity, double their production, and cut the price of a barrel of oil in half. Can they do that and economically survive? Yes. But they would economically ruin other than more recalcitrant members of OPEC. 75% of the membership of OPEC is another supranational organization that we studied in class. These are terms very familiar to my students. The Organization of Arab Petroleum Exporting Countries. So Iran is not a member of OAPEC because they're not Arab. Bahrain does not produce enough oil to be a member of OPEC, but they are a member of OAPEC. So the supranational organizations, the Gulf Cooperation Council, are really very important in understanding our commitment to Syria. The United States does nothing until the Gulf Cooperation Council reviews that initiative. Members of the Gulf Cooperation Council, all the Arabian Peninsula states with the exception of Yemen. Arab, Iraq, Persian, Iran. Look at the oil fields up the Zagros Mountains. This is an anthropo-geographic boundary. Along this boundary, created by the British. They created Iraq, the Kingdom of Iraq out of Mesopotamia. Tremendous amounts of conflict since at least the 15th century. Muslim world. Look at North Africa and Southwest Asia. Overwhelmingly, 93% of the people in that area identify themselves as Muslim. 3% as Christian, 2% as citizens of Israel, and you have to be an Orthodox Jew to be a citizen of Israel. Although there are Arab Israelis, by and large, full citizenship reserved only for Orthodox. 2%. And even less in terms of Israel's total territorial confines. Shia Islam. Michael was talking about the great arc of the Shia, and here it is. So when you look at history, a lot of the Shia orders or movements, such as the Alawites, on the bottom of the social and economic strata, political initiative, especially in terms of the Ba'ath Party, they rose to the top in terms of political leadership, but also, most importantly, in understanding the Middle East, as the principal constituency of the officer corps of the military. And in my view, in studying institutions of the Middle East, it is the military that transfers the customs and the traditions of a society from generation to generation, and not civilian institutions, the military. And additionally, if you look at the past, that tells you a lot about the future. Egypt. Past of Egypt is what? Military. General Sadat, General Nasser, General Mubarak, and probably the current president of Egypt. All right? When you look at Libya, Gaddafi would not even allow oftentimes his personal guard to have ammunition for their weapons. And he would not issue ammunition generally to the regular army in Libya. And he had major subsidies to the various tribes. Libya was a loose confederation of tribal areas, not really a nation state. Not really a nation state today. Look at Tunisia. I had lunch one day in Tunis with the director of the Tunisian Women's Rights Commission. Tunisia has a long history of experimenting with Western democratic institutions. And looking at the Arab Spring, Tunisia, of course, is projecting that experience in terms of their future. So look at the past of these political geographies if you want an inkling or insights into terms of what's going to happen in the future. Look at the past. If you look at the 7 great oil transit points of the world, 4 of them are in our study area. Bab el-Mandeb, here, Suez, Hormuz, Turkey Straits, and Gibraltar. And here they are. Centrality. We're not going to advance our strategic interests in Europe, Africa, or Asia without being involved in this region. And of course, the Black Sea, Sea of Marmara, the Turkey Straits, extremely important to Russia. Suez Canal. Every major trading power in the world uses Suez every month. You don't want to use Suez, several thousand miles of steam time out of your way, and that adds significantly to the price of your product. Hydropolitics. The Euphrates, 90% of all Syrian water comes from the Euphrates. 90%. The Atatürk Dam in Turkey. Syria's relationships with Turkey are not very good. I have jumped across the Euphrates. They close the gates on the Atatürk Dam, and the Euphrates dries up to a trickle. And they do that, claiming they need to do maintenance on the gates at the Euphrates. So Syria had to build a lake, Lake Assad, in order to tide them over, because the majority of the labor force of Syria are involved in either agriculture, processing food, selling food, something to do with food. The vast majority of Syria is desert. So the Syrian grain belt and the Syrian agricultural areas are extremely important. So the issue of hydropolitics, we don't really think about that. But the Nile, and we could talk all day about the Nile, but nevertheless, the White and the Blue Nile in the Sudan, it rarely rains in Egypt. It's the Blue Nile. It originates in Lake Tana, Egypt's old enemy, Ethiopia. That's most important. The majority of the water of the Nile system evaporates before it gets to Egypt proper. Political conflict. Mike had a very pointed remark to make in terms of war and destabilization. When you look at the various wars, they have created the current political geography of the most contested areas of the Central Pivot. 48 war, 66, 67, 73, and Israel's most disastrous fight, invasion of Lebanon, after which Hezbollah was created. Hamas, Hezbollah, and of course we hear a great deal about the various weapons emanating from this area, chemical attacks. We'll hear from experts in that regard. Any questions? No question? Okay. Next, I would, I'd like to forego our break. All right, if that's okay. Feel free to go back and forth. Facilities, get refreshments. Russian geopolitical interests, including Syria and the Levant. Kevin Culhane. Map of Russia.
I'm going to have to sleep up there. Yeah, please.
Okay. You got a map of Russia.
Thank you. Good to see many of you. I presented my Afghanistan class. I recognize a lot of folks here. But I'm going to go a little. I'm going to actually try to do the 10 minutes that Dr. Self said we had to get us back on track. So some of this is going to be, I've put it together. 10 minutes to present something like this for me is like impossible. So I wrote it down. I'll be reading some of it. I apologize for that. We can get into more discussion later. I'm also going to focus more on Russia. All right. I know that it's got Levant, and I know it's got Syria, and that's where we're going. But I got to give you sort of an overall, my intention is give you an overall philosophy about Russia and where it stands today and how it got there. My good friend Dan Van Gundy will talk a lot about Russia and Syria, so I'll leave that to him. But I'll get us there. So it'll be, I'll get us back on time, promise, as close to it as I can. And as I said, I'll stay focused on sort of more on the Russia aspect. I apologize for the reading, but 10 minutes is 10 minutes.
All right.
I can't clear my throat in 10 minutes most of the time. Okay. Let me do this. As I watched the developments in the last couple of days, mainly in Ukraine, and as I was preparing this, I said, you know, how could there anything be better for me to set the stage for the lead-in? Because overall, what we're talking about is a Russia attitude. It's got a lot to do with Ukraine, but it can be projected very easily, certainly into Syria, the Levant, and other locations. So let me go through a little of this, and then we can chat about it. What I'm going to talk about is the broader Russian, and you have to read Vladimir Putin because he plays such a significant role in all of this process. What his foreign policy strategy as he attempts to reestablish and reshape Russia's sphere of influence in the world, and that certainly extending into Syria and the Levant. Putin's focus, which was definitively laid out in an Izvestia article back in October 2011, which describes a new integration project for Eurasia and envisions the creation of a Eurasia Union by 2015, that being next year, and that's still in the works. The purpose of the Eurasia Union would be to reassert Russian control over the former Soviet Union and beyond. Putin famously stated in 2005 that the collapse of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century and a genuine tragedy for the Russian people. So think a little bit about this as it relates not only to Syria and the Levant, but also when we consider what's going on today in Ukraine. His focus was to reverse the post-Soviet erosion of Russian power, especially vis-a-vis the United States, NATO, China, and India. While the basic component of the Eurasian Union is ostensibly economic, that being a counterweight to the European Union, the EU. Putin's promotion of the Eurasian Union was a strategic move actually aimed at three specific things. First, creating an independent pole in the perceived global multipolar system by consolidating the Eastern Slavic Christian Orthodox demographic core and the industrial and natural resources of Kazakhstan. Second, meeting the Chinese economic challenges, primarily in Central Asia. And third, opposing the Islamic expansion into Central Asia, the North Caucasus, Siberia, the Urals, and the Volga region. We've seen some of that in the preparation and lead up to the Olympics, of course, where a lot of terrorist attacks occurred in the Volga region, as we well know. On this last point, Russia is facing an Islamic insurgency in the North Caucasus that threatens to turn the whole region into a haven for international terrorism. Following the American departure from Afghanistan at the end of this year, either in total or in part, a surge of extremists from Afghanistan into Central Asia and from the North Caucasus into the rest of Russia would be Moscow's worst nightmare. Insurgency, cross-border infiltration, the smuggling, and especially the acute through Tajikistan, which shares the porous 800-mile border with Afghanistan. The long border is a major avenue for smuggling of Afghan drugs into Russia and Europe. In Russia, which has approximately 2.5 million heroin addicts, drugs have become a health disaster. Additionally, Russia is also undertaking its own pivot to Asia for political and economic reasons. First, the Putin administration is tired of Western leaders lecturing them about the political freedoms and human rights. Second, Russian trade with the EU is stagnant, and business with the United States remains abnormally low due to overall hostilities between the two countries. Russia's far eastern and Siberian federal districts, which share land borders with China, Kazakhstan, and Mongolia, account for 66% of Russian territory. With Asia's growing importance, it is understandable that Eurasia integration is strategically appealing to the Russian leadership. Finally, Russia is striving to create a sphere of influence in Eurasia, making it more difficult for foreign powers, especially the United States and China, to operate in Central Asia, the Caucasus, or the western tier of the Commonwealth of Independent States, that being Belarus, Moldova, and Ukraine. The Kremlin was frightened by the color revolutions in Ukraine and in Georgia and views them as U.S.-led conspiracies aimed at undermining Russian influence. Furthermore, more nationalistic and Eurasianists view the revolutions as rehearsals for pro-American political forces to topple the current regime in Russia. I want to stress that this is, a lot of people don't view it this way, but I'm sure Mr. Putin does. He just saw his good buddy in the Ukraine, the president of Ukraine, go down. If you don't think he isn't looking over his shoulder, watching how quickly that happened, and what really, over a matter of days, very significant, and it will burn deeply into Putin's psyche as a former KGB guy, which he was. As I said, I'm sure that Mr. Van Gundy and others will delve more into the Russian aspect and coordination and cooperation with Syria, but I think an overall view of what's driving the Russian influence into the region was important, and I tried to make up the 10 minutes that we were supposed to do. So if I have any questions, I'll be happy to answer. Yes?
This is now breaking news that the Russian president asked Russian parliament for to use armed forces in an invasion of Ukraine.
That's just happened?
Just happened.
Yeah, I don't think that'd be a surprise to anybody, and I don't want to turn this into a Ukraine discussion, but it's a point that you really have to understand what drives them to do all this. The Crimea is as we were talking with General Hayden before, it's a tough example because for those that know the region, the Crimea is heavily Russian, historically Russian. It was created in 1954. Khrushchev decided it was going to be Ukrainian. Why exactly? If there was it's an autonomous republic, meaning it's slightly different. It does maintain its own sort of semi-independence, even from Ukraine. If there was a vote in the Crimea today about where would you rather go, I think there's no doubt in the numbers they would vote to actually go back and join the Russian Federation. I think that is the case. Do I think the United States, because of all of these reasons, because the Black Sea Fleet is there, do I think NATO or the EU or the United States is going to jump up and down and say, line in the sand? I do not. So it's a pretty safe bet for Putin to begin what I think is sort of a longer vision of what he sees Russia's goal in the world. This quote that he made about the catastrophic event of the Soviet Union, he truly believes that. He's an old KGB guy, more of my vintage than of most. That's how he views the world. And I think that's going to have a lot to do with the way the Russians play in Syria. I'll let the experts talk to you about. Any other questions on the Russian? Yes, sir.
Is this Eurasian Union like an economic Warsaw Pact, maintaining the country boundaries as they are today?
Great question. Yeah, and it does reflect its initial makeup was Kazakhstan, Belarus, and Russia, and then it's over time Putin's redefined it and is attempting to redefine it into picking up a whole lot more territory. He's now using it as a buffer against China and Central Asia with all the natural resources, using it against a buffer against the EU. The concept is economic, but there is a military aspect of it. The problem with it all is that and for Putin and for Russia, in developing something like the Eurasian Union, is it's a one-way street as the Russians view it. There's not this integration like there is in the EU and other organizations such as that in the Far East. The Russian idea of it is we lead it, it's our rules, you follow our rules. If you don't, we shut off the gas, we shut off the oil. It's punitive. There's really not a lot to it. And you got to look at it on the other side. There's a lot of people that don't want to get involved with Russia because they don't bring much to the table. They don't export anything. They've got no industry. The money, all that money that's coming into the country, based almost exclusively on raw materials, is going right back out of Russia. To about 0.1% of the Russian oligarchs that money is coming in and it's going right out into foreign bank accounts, offshore accounts. None of it's being invested in Russia, and that's a real problem. So I heard a presentation the other day that someone made that Russia is a failed state today. I think it's a stretch slightly, but not too far off. And again, I don't want to turn this into a Russia class, but there's a lot of things that would say that this is true. One of the most, it's just a medical type thing, that overall age, it's the only Western so-called industrial country in the world where the overall age of folks, the longevity is dropping. It's only in the 50s, I believe, for males in Russia. There's a lot of things that are going badly, but in my mind, it's the lack of reinvestment of all of this money, billions of dollars. I mean, you can find more Russian billionaires living now in Miami Beach than you will around Moscow, but it's just the way it is, I guess. Yes?
How strong is the Russian military, really?
Yeah, it's a great question. And Mr. Van Gundy and I wrote, this is my claim to fame in the day, it used to be a document called Russian Military Power, Soviet Military Power. It was people would wait for it to come out once a year. It was this glossy magazine that the government put out. It was initially, and I wrote the first one and collaborated on most of the second one. In the day, it was the basis for actually using it to develop our defense budget. So in order to get a big defense budget, you got to say that person that is on the other side that you're spending money against is 85 feet tall, as we used to say. A lot of exaggeration and whatnot. I personally think the Russian military is a mere shadow. Yeah, I don't view it like other people. That there really isn't much there. There really isn't much there. Half of the fleet, 3/4 of the fleets in Vladivostok in the north, and even down in the Black Sea, these ships can't even get off, can't even leave the mooring. So that's my opinion. There's probably people that will very, look at that. I don't know who saw a view of these so-called Spetsnaz and special forces people that were supposedly went into Ukraine. If you saw the stuff on TV last night, if you know much about soldiers, you can just tell by the way they walk, by the way they hold their weapons, how they handle themselves as to how special they are. These were kids. Yeah, it's another story. That's probably time for another class. But that's my view of it. The Russian role, it's Putin. A lot of this stuff that goes on with Syria, a lot of this, the projection is Putin. He's just driven to this idea of the reestablishment of the greater Russian, Soviet Union, greater Russia influence in the world. I think he's fighting an uphill battle personally, but it's what the man does, so that's what you got to deal with. That's what you got to consider when you talk about Russian strategic vision, and that strategic vision also projected into the Mediterranean. Any other question? Yes, sir.
Russia defended Syria several times in the UN and just by giving aid. Russia defended Syria several times in the Security Council by giving
yes.
aid. What invested interests do they have in Syria?
Okay, that's going to be covered. Mr. Van Gundy is going to cover that. I've saw his briefing, and there are others that we'll be able to discuss that. It's a great question. It's really kind of why we're here on that aspect of it. I'm sure they'll cover that, and I'll allow them to do that. Sure. Any other questions? Okay, well, Burl, you owe me for getting you back.
Thank you, Kevin. I'd also add that during Kevin's 2 combat tours in Vietnam, he was deeply involved in Operation Phoenix. Dan Van Gundy is a Special Forces veteran and also was at one time a military attaché in Moscow. Can tell him about your experience in Russia?
I'll mention it briefly.
Okay, all right, thank you. But Dan is very well researched and briefed in terms of Russian geopolitical behavior. He is also a former Russian foreign area officer. Dan.
Let me, can I get my briefing slides up on the screen here? That's it. All right. Sorry for the delay. I'm going to.
How'd you do that, Ron?
Just drag it across.
Just drag it.
Yeah, just pull it
Drag
to
it.
the next string.
We'll go with this then. All right. As Professor Self mentioned, I'm a former Army intelligence officer, served 24 years. I was trained as a Russian Foreign Area officer, like Dr. Culhane, and served as a variety of intel assignments as focusing on USSR. After I retired from one of my assignments was as an Army attaché in Moscow. That assignment was abbreviated when I was expelled and declared persona non grata. I have the distinction of being the last Army attaché expelled from the Soviet Union. There have been others expelled from Russia since then, but that's, I suppose, a dubious distinction, but that's my history. After I retired, I worked for the Defense Intelligence Agency as a Russian analyst for 21 years, serving in current intelligence as a Deputy Defense Intelligence Officer and later as a senior expert on DIA's international engagement methods. I've been asked to address Russia's geopolitical focus on Syria. So I thought a good way to begin would be to look at Russia's national interests first. These national interests, if you look at them, haven't changed a great deal from the Soviet era, as with the exception of the absence here of the ideological aspects of Marxism-Leninism. But generally, there's some continuity here, and I think that that you'll find that the national interests here at numbers 3, 5, 6, and 7 bear directly upon Russia's geopolitical focus on Syria. This list, by the way, is was put together by professors Graham Allison and Robert Blackwell at Harvard in a document in 2011 that focused on Task Force on Russia and U.S. National Interest. So if you're curious how they got there, it's worth taking a look at. Since the end of the Cold War and the collapse of the USSR, and with it the lessening of the threat of nuclear war, Russia has faced another threat, and especially since the early 90s, this threat is they see as terrorism and threat to Russia's territorial integrity. Glasnost and Perestroika and the late Gorbachev era resulted in relaxation of traditionally rigid Soviet prohibitions on national expression. But in that late Soviet era, and certainly after the collapse of the Soviet Union, national expression flourished, and especially in areas that had not been part of the Russian Empire for as long as the core elements. Especially in the North Caucasus, there was a renaissance of political and religious experimentation, return to traditions. And this is an area that is largely, or was largely Muslim before Russia and later the Soviets imposed their will upon the region. Naturally, the Soviet view and the Russian view of the independence-minded regions in Russia's south, they took a dim view of this. If you remember, in the early 1990s, one of these North Caucasian republics, Chechnya, seceded from the Russian Federation, and the results were pretty bloody. Grozny was essentially reduced to ruin, and the Second Chechen War was fought in the mid-1990s. Interestingly, a political Russian politician who was a candidate for the presidency, visiting the Pentagon in the mid-90s, stated that Russia's objectives for the Second Chechen War would be to threaten the entire republic and destroy everything in it. That attempt was almost successful, although national aspirations continue in the region, and it's a constant worry for the Russians. They believe that the independence movements, and especially the religiously motivated organizations, are directly supported by international terrorist organizations. They made a great deal, have captured Al-Qaeda operatives in Chechnya and in Ingushetia and other regions in the North Caucasus. From time to time, they reassert these claims. They also see unrest in the Middle East and Islamic inroads in Central Asia and the North Caucasus. That's threatening their preeminence in the sphere of influence that Dr. Colleen mentioned. Several Sunni Islamic movements, such as the Islamic Renaissance Party in Tajikistan, the Islamic movement of Uzbekistan, and the Party of Liberation, Hizb ut-Tahrir in primarily in Uzbekistan, but also in several of the Central Asian republics and in Azerbaijan, advocate the establishment of the caliphate, return to Sharia law, and since the mid-1990s have been involved in anti-regime activity in each of the former Soviet republics in Central Asia. Russia considers most of these organizations to be terrorist organizations. Again, turning another of Russia's interests, Professor Self has already discussed briefly the region's energy environment. The bulk of Russia's energy exports move to Europe through pipelines, principally through Ukraine. However, a number of pipelines are routed for transshipment of oil and gas from former Soviet republics such as Azerbaijan and Kazakhstan, either north into Russia and to the Black Sea coast, where they're transshipped or moved by pipeline, or directly through Georgia to Turkey. Additionally, pipelines from Novorossiysk on the Black Sea to Turkey are being planned. Unrest in the North Caucasus, or in Turkey, or in the former Soviet republics in Central Asia, threaten the uninterrupted flow of these petroleum products. Interruption of the flow would negatively affect Russian energy companies' holdings in the region. For example, Rosneft, the state-owned energy company, oil company, operates a refinery across the Dark Cry on the Black Sea, and there in joint venture with ExxonMobil is exploiting oil deposits in the Black Sea. Unrest would jeopardize business deals such as the ExxonMobil joint venture. Similarly, Gazprom, the large gas company that is state-owned as well, is planning a pipeline from Krasnodar Krai to Bulgaria across the Black Sea. Unrest and disruption of this pipeline's development also is not in Russia's national interest. I'll briefly mention that, as you know, Russia is only the second largest exporter of arms to the world after the United States. A quarter of Russia's arms sales are in North Africa and the Middle East. A large share of that used to be sold to Libya. Those sales have ceased. And sales to Syria, I understand, have slowed as a result of unsure whether the regime can actually make payments for the arms. But nevertheless, they represent a significant loss of income to oligarchs that control Russia's state-owned armaments businesses. Thus, Russia views the Middle East and especially Syria as having potential threats to its national interests. I've gone over some of those. In Moscow's view, instability in the region has the potential to fuel national self-determination movements in Russia's south, to pose risks to existing energy export pathways, and to discourage business partnerships with energy firms, and to further weaken Russia's arms sales in the region. In Russia's calculus, finding a solution that keeps the Assad regime in power and prevents the breakup of the country is a high priority. In Russia's view, intervention in Syria to effect regime change or humanitarian assistance should be opposed and prevented. I'm not going to say at all costs, but that's a goal. Russia's formulation to protect its interests in the status quo ante in Syria are embodied in these principles. It's tempting to question how these espoused values square with Russia's intervention in South Ossetia or its recognition of Abkhazia and South Ossetian independence in 2008, or whether or not they will prevent Russians from intervening in Ukraine. But those probably are questions for another seminar. How's Russia doing? It's kind of a scorecard. Based on these outcomes and what I've stated are Russia's desires for continuation of the Assad regime, they're relatively successful so far. As the general mentioned, I think from a Russian perspective, the worst outcome would be the division of the country into Sunnistan, perhaps a portion of it becoming part of a greater Kurdistan, involvement of Turkey in combating this Kurdish nationalist formation and the disruption, therefore, of Russian energy exports through the region. The best solution for Russia is the continuation of the Assad regime and prevention of the export of Sunni-based, in their view, revolution into Russia's soft underbelly. Any questions?
Thank you, Dan. Rick? Oh, excuse me. remember that Colonel retired Brighoff is actively involved in Iran's analysis of their nuclear potential. Colonel Brighoff was also very active in the 2003 war with Iraq in terms of search for WMD. He's very experienced in the Middle East. He's no stranger to conflict. His academic background includes a master's in nuclear engineering, and he's a graduate of the United States Military Academy in West Point. Brett?
Yeah, good morning. Some of you guys have heard my talk before on kind of the world global nuclear perspective, who has them, who wants them, who wanted them and no longer want them, who had them and who got rid of them. But I'm going to really focus in on this region and some of the issues on non-proliferation, Iran, and actually Syria's proliferation aims, which are hopefully on hold at this point. A lot of unknowns there. And much like these other governmental outside of government organizations affect this landscape, the Treaty on Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons really drives kind of this proliferation landscape and how we deal with nuclear wannabes in the world. Real quickly, again, try to keep us on track. The objective is non-proliferation. If you don't have nuclear weapons, if you're a signatory to this treaty, you're not going to go after developing nuclear weapons capability. Disarmament. If you have nuclear weapons, you're supposed to go to zero. So we, as a signatory to the nuclear weapons, are supposed to disarm. And then, under the NPT, the inherent right of nations to use nuclear technology for peaceful purposes, much like explosives. Nuclear technology has probably more useful benefits to mankind than they do mass destruction. NPT's been around since the 60s, entered in force in the 70s. Most of the world has signed up on the NPT. When the NPT first came into force, there was a subset category that you could be in called nuclear weapon states. If you had nuclear weapons at that time, you were kind of put off to the side. You were able to maintain that nuclear weapon facilities and the things dedicated to your nuclear stockpile as out of the safeguards regime of this treaty. So the International Atomic Energy Agency, the UN watchdog for this treaty, does not have the right to go into a nuclear weapon state and look at our nuclear weapons infrastructure. Just our peaceful use infrastructure. And we as a nation, the Russians as a nuclear weapon state, France, the UK, and China can tell the IAEA what they can look at and what they can't look at. If you weren't a nuclear weapon state and signed up to the treaty, then any nuclear infrastructure you had to be declared to the IAEA at least 180 days before it comes online and actually starts processing nuclear material and opens safeguards inspections to make sure that that technology was not going to be diverted to weapons use. Since the treaty has come into effect, around the time the treaty came into effect, 4 non-weapon states have actually developed nuclear capability, and they also were the ones that weren't, and have never signed up the treaty. India, Israel, Pakistan, South Sudan has never signed the treaty, and I have no idea why. Syria and Iran are both parties to the NPT as non-nuclear weapon states. There's in the 90s, a move to more comprehensive safeguard, more intrusive inspections. Neither one of those nations have signed up for the additional safeguards agreements with the IAEA. However, both of these have interesting non-proliferation aspects with them. On my opening slide, that destroyed facility was a North Korean designed nuclear reactor that was destroyed by the Israelis in 2007 in Syria. Also important to understand before I jump into the nation states, the nuclear fuel cycle, which is driving the big discussions between the IAEA, the P5+1 group of primarily Western nations and Iran, on how a peaceful process can be diverted to a nuclear weapon process and all the things in this. Like most things, uranium coming out of the ground is not useful for much. You have to convert it into some chemical compound, which then you can enrich. You have to increase one of the isotopes in uranium to make it usable in a reactor. In a reactor, you have to enrich it to about a 5% level to get it to sustain a nuclear reaction to make power with. To get a nuclear weapon, you have to go up to 95 or so percent. That's high enriched aspect. And that's why the enrichment facilities are such the key sticking point in the negotiations with Iran is if they're able to enrich up to 4.5%, they have the technology to take it all the way up to weapons usable material. And that's in putting a safeguard on that to make sure none of that is diverted into a weapons program is key, and why the U.S. primarily doesn't want any nation state to have their own enrichment capability other than us and them that already have it. That fuel then can be put into a nuclear, that uranium fuel into a nuclear reactor, then makes power, makes medical isotopes and nuclear medicine products. But that uranium, while it's sitting there cooking away making energy, also turns itself into plutonium as part of this process. That plutonium then can be reprocessed out and used in a nuclear weapon if it's designed right. So what does that mean to Iran and Syria, and why do we have some concerns with what they're doing? Iran's nuclear program, several pretty robust nuclear program. They have several research sites dedicated primarily to agriculture research. A lot of problems with agriculture has been done away with through irradiating of seeds and killing parasites on those seeds, and has done a lot in increasing agriculture output in third world nations. A lot of that research we found in Iran was going on, which kind of gave us some indications there was some weird stuff going on. We got in there, it was just agricultural research with nuclear radiators. They have 2 uranium mines. They have ingenious uranium. Nothing surprising there. Uranium is really common throughout the world. They have a research reactor, a U.S. provided research reactor on the Atoms for Peace program in the 1950s. Interesting footnote, the U.S. and Russia, under the Atoms for Peace program, put a bunch of research reactors out there for academic purposes and nuclear medicine purposes. Unfortunately, the uranium we used to fuel those reactors, because it was more efficient, was weapons usable material. So us and the Russians have spent billions of dollars repatriating that material since the fall of the Soviet Union to try to keep that from getting into a hands of somebody we didn't want to have it. That research reactor they have, that research reactor outlived its usefulness, and they built the Iranians built their own reactor under their own program, which is a reactor which could be diverted to producing plutonium fairly easily off a French design. But the main concern is the uranium processing facilities developing their own fuel cycle process and the enrichment plants that can easily be diverted to making weapons usable material. A lot of angst between the Western states and the Iranians on what's going on. A lot of outside help on their nuclear weapons or on their nuclear program was coming from China, Argentina, France, and the Russians. And to some extent, it was primarily through Western influence that those nations backed off on exporting some of this technology, even though it was allowable under the NPT to Iran. That has caused some issues that I'll get into in the next slide. Does Iran have a nuclear weapon program? The official report is no. The IAEA has uncovered no indications that there is a robust nuclear weapons program. However, when the Ayatollah took over in 1979, the Shah did have a clandestine nuclear weapons program and was diverting some of his resources pursuing nuclear weapons. The Ayatollah actually issued a fatwa that said that was completely immoral and they would never go after that. There are some lower clerics in the nation that has allowed that under fatwas, but primarily the religious leadership in the state does not feel that nuclear weapons are within their moral purview. In 2003, was when we, as a world, uncovered the Iranian enrichment programs. It had not been declared. It was through national technical means that it was uncovered, and at that point we began to suspect what their true motives were. And has been the running battle with the IEA ever since is we keep uncovering undeclared sites the more we dig into what's going on. And the spark, the sanctions started in 2006, 8 UN Security Council resolutions, and I started having flashbacks to Iraq of resolution after resolution after resolution until we finally decided to go take some action positive. Unlike Iraq this time, just last November, and the agreement really taken off here just in the last week, the P5 in Iran agreeing to freeze aspects of their program, mainly their enrichment program. They're not going to enrich above 5% in exchange for us reducing the sanctions. Again, just because they agree not to enrich the 5% doesn't mean that they can't rapidly replumb those centrifuges and get the weapons-grade material, or that they already do not have enough material to make a nuclear weapon from the existing program. Again, no real indication that they have gone to that level yet or have an existing nuclear weapons program. Big question always comes up, why does Iran want a nuclear program or a nuclear weapon? Why is it worth Iran and going through almost 10 years of sanctions to maintain this capability? Primarily it's symbolic importance. It's national pride. These guys have been a leader culturally, religiously, economically in that area for centuries. They're kind of upset about all the Western influence of, we've got it, we don't want you to have it, and we're going to put up all these roadblocks against you. And so this is kind of a way of affirming to the world that despite what you think, we're going to go after this. We're a sovereign nation. It's within our rights under the NPT to develop this technology. And again, just defy what they perceive as Western efforts to control, exploit, or weaken them. And then fundamentally, a weapons program, defense, mainly to deter what they would see as perceived foreign threats. If you look at who has nuclear weapons in the regions and why they have them over time, no two nuclear weapon states has ever gone to war. Gone close a few times, but has never gone to war. Primarily, it's a negotiating chip at the table. This would actually give them a pretty good regional hegemon in there and put them back on the international front. Sometimes the water cooler talk we have around the way is, Russia really only has a big seat at the table and has any negotiating power with us because of their large nuclear stockpile that deters us and kind of enters into our equations at all times. And just another footnote based upon the early conversation, the Russian military being neutered, degraded, not well trained, actually raises the chance that they will use their nuclear stockpile if it ever came to a push, because of the mismatch between our conventional forces and their conventional forces. They would have to maybe rely on their nuclear weapons to help win a fight. Again, some of the bumper stickers in, do they have a peaceful program or a weapons program? Debate still rages on. Again, no real indication of a true weapons program. There are some interesting features of their program that makes you go, but the big thing is proving the negative. With the IEA looking at all their facilities not finding evidence, how do you prove that negative and satisfy the IEA and the rest of the world that, yeah, this is truly peaceful, especially after the high level of distrust of going in and time after time finding undeclared facilities. And then what's the effect on the region and the world of a nuclear-armed Iran is always the debate. Are they an irrational actor who, as soon as they get the capability, going to put it on a missile and take Israel off the face of the earth? Or are they, like I believe, more of a rational actor with the long-term goal that this is a capability they would want mainly to deter aggression and reduce the Western influence on their calculus. Syria, prior to the current conflict, did maintain a civil nuclear program, had a declared research reactor for research purposes, had made repeated attempts over the years to purchase small nuclear reactors for China, Russia, and Argentina. Again, through Western influence, China, Russia, and Argentina did not provide those reactors over time. They were buying the technology in the reactors that had high enriched uranium that can be diverted for other purposes. But what really sparked interest back in the 2007 timeframe was the Israeli airstrike on the Al-Kibar reactor. In the Al-Kibar province, the North Koreans were working with the Syrians to develop a nuclear reactor. Primarily what they said was for peaceful purposes after it came out, but it was designed just like the Nongbong reactor in North Korea, which was used to produce plutonium for nuclear weapons. It was done under the cover of darkness. They were actually building the reactor under a shroud so satellite imagery couldn't pick it up. The Israelis, prior to the reactor, or what they assessed prior to the reactor being fueled, just like they did in Iraq back in the 80s, went in and destroyed the facility with an airstrike. After repeated attempts, the Syrians finally let the IAEA onto the site, did find traces of man-made uranium, processed uranium, which solidified that was going to be a nuclear facility and not just a military facility under construction or any. What the real true purpose is still unclear. And the world is unclear on the extent of that cooperation between North Korea and Syria and what the true intent was going forward. Again, lots of reasons you would want a nuclear weapon if you live in a bad neighborhood like they do to keep Western influence out. But one of the main concerns the U.S. has, and one of our overarching non-proliferation concerns is, and why we don't want places like Syria having nuclear technologies that can be diverted to nuclear weapons, is when a nation state fails or control is lost, much like the chemical stockpiles in Libya. There was concern with that when the conflict in Libya was going on, is what happens to that material when the government loses control of that material and who gets it. And if, especially in this neighborhood, if that material, that technology gets into the hands of Al-Qaeda, for example, that could jumpstart a program, and that's one of our biggest fears is when a terrorist gets this type of weapon. I think that's all. Any questions? Sir.
South Africa was reported to have nuclear weapons.
Had.
Yes, they had a nuclear weapons program. Did any of the technology make its way to the Middle East, or did we get in South Africa?
As far as I know, the technology can walk a bunch of different ways. The key is, does the material and the technology and the capability to make the material walk? As far as I know, the South Africans have maintained all their material. This stuff doesn't go away. It lasts forever. You can't burn it. You can't destroy that chemical weapon. You can demill it and make it into unusable component pieces. And the South Africans have control over it with the Mumbai facility, Telendava facility in northern South Africa. They maintain that, and it's still there as far as we know. It's not in a weapon configuration, but all the materials. Yeah.
When this present agreement expires, what's the opinion of how fast, based on Iranian facilities, how fast could they create a nuclear weapon?
So a lot of assumptions are being made. Most people say if they decided today to go after it, it'd be 1 year before they would have a functioning weapon. Whether or not they were able to mate it to a delivery system effectively is still ongoing. They figure 5 years for that, but they think to have an actual functioning weapon 1 year.
Could Iran become a nuclear power by, say, North Korea gave them a nuclear warhead and has become a nuclear power overnight with the North Korean warheads?
Sure. Well, that's assuming North Korea has nuclear warheads. We know North Korea has nuclear devices. They detonated 2 underground. But whether or not they're actually field deployable, usable nuclear weapons is another thing. But true. I mean, after the fall of the Soviet Union, we had 4 nuclear powers created overnight because a lot of the Russian stockpiles in Kazakhstan, Belarus, Ukraine, and I think one of the other stands. And luckily, and through a lot of negotiation, most of that was repatriated back to the Soviet Union because they just didn't want to deal with it. These things are not cheap to maintain. Yeah.
How would Israel respond to how international the U.S. convince them to what we do?
So if I understand your question, so if Iran gets a nuclear weapon, how would Israel respond? So Israel, though has never declared it, kind of the world knows that Israel has nuclear weapons. One of my favorite Clancy novels is basically. It's hard to tell what anybody's really going to do. A lot of declaratory and posturing going on. A study at the Army War College did in the seminar they held, the consensus came out of that Israel really isn't concerned with Iran getting a bomb. They don't believe that Iran would actually launch a nuclear strike on Israel, a preemptive strike or the first strike on Israel, because the rest of the world's retaliation or going after them for doing that. In Israel, it's just national survival. It's not going to take a lot of nuclear weapons. Israel's great, too small. They're not going to absorb much of a nuclear strike. So they don't think they're going to get a first strike. They think it's just going to may even stabilize some of the relationships with that. This is how it's going to go. They really don't feel threatened by it other than, again, one of the underlying concerns of all this is those nuclear weapons getting into the hands of non-nation-state actors and how those non-nation-state actors, Iran, Hezbollah, issues. That's the risk.
Have the opposition forces in Syria showed any lack of indication of desiring nuclear weapons?
No, not that I know of. Not that I've heard any rumblings at all.
Is there a concern of the other Sunni states, a proliferation of nuclear weapons in those states if Iran were to get a weapon so that they would match their power?
I think if Iran got close to getting a nuclear weapon or got a nuclear weapon, you would see Saudi Arabia and Turkey seriously consider starting their own programs. Right now, the U.S. has this thing we call extended deterrence. Turkey is part of NATO; it's just kind of covered under that. But we extend our deterrence to our friends and allies that says, a nuclear strike or somebody threaten you with nuclear weapons, our nuclear stockpile and our nuclear deterrent will help cover you. Primarily what's kept Japan from going after the program associated with North Korea and China.
If North Korea's nuclear tech isn't really that great, why? Like, what would they benefit from working with Syria?
Money. It's primarily money. My opinion is primarily a money driver, and to some extent, exchange of technology. North Korea's nuclear program again was jump-started by Western putting atoms for peace nuclear technology in there for exchange for other things, and then it's been diverted over time. But what North Korea really needs, and what North Korea dealing with other states have really gone after missile technology so that they can deliver that nuclear device.
So we know that Iran is running a program, right? So not until we figure out it's harmful or that it's peaceful. So can UN engage in regulation on that program, just like they did for
Yeah, and so the whole Non-Proliferation Treaty IAEA construct is that I declare this nuclear facility as a declared facility, and that opens up for periodic inspections. So for these enrichment facilities, what can be done and what has been done other places is they monitor the in-stock and the output and make sure what's coming in and what's going out, and that way they can determine whether something's being diverted and it's going to enrichment. It's real-time monitoring of the enrichment levels and the quantities going in on these things. Satellite link to Vienna, where the IAEA headquarters is. Again, that all can be defeated if you want to do that, but then it's also on-ground inspections and surprise inspections. That whole additional safeguards agreement are really getting into that intrusive stuff. But that's how we do that under the NPT. It's again, what's not declared, which is concerning. So when we get information, or the IAEA gets information that there's this other site, and then they go to these other sites, that's when you start mistrusting each other and you try to figure out what's going on. My understanding is that other than the alternate centrifuge sites, which really makes sense if you're Iran, and they weren't declared because history shows that as you start getting to a weapons type capability right before you get to that, F-16s are going to show up and bomb your facility. There's kind of a history here with that. It's a logistical problem from a military perspective getting that far into Iran. But so that would, as a nation state, want me to disperse my capability, not put my eggs all in one basket. So it makes perfect sense that they had this hidden capability somewhere else to hedge their bet and maintain their investment. There were some indications that there were some weapons-related research facilities in different parts, although when the IAEA went to those facilities, they didn't find anything of importance. Again, IAEA has not uncovered anything specifically dedicated to nuclear weapons.
Thank you, Brent. You bet. Brent raised some very interesting points. Inside Iran, the primary debate on the need for nuclear weapons focuses on Pakistan. Pakistan views Iran as a major competitor in that part of the world, and Iran views Pakistan as a potential aggressor. Pakistan is a nuclear armed nation. So that's the debate inside Iran. Next we have Zahra Mirza. Zahra really understands Saudi public opinion, and she's a Meccan, so she's at the center of religion in Saudi Arabia, and she understands the role of Sunni Islam and Saudi foreign policy very well. Zahra? We may go to lunch a little late. There's going to be a crowd there anyway, I was told, and so we might delay our lunch break a little bit. Anyway, have a good lunch afterwards, and we'll conclude our similar discussions thereafter, and then start our GIS in one of our labs upstairs.
Hello all. Well, I'm not expert as the others experts are high. Like they have many expertise, but I'm not. I'm just a student. But I hope I can give you some information about the Saudi view of Syria. First of all, to begin with, many of you did not have background on Saudi Arabia, so I'll start with the brief history. It was founded in 1932 by King Abdulaziz bin Saud. It's called the land of the Holy Two Mosques because it's contained the most holiest places for Muslims, which is first the Masjid al-Nabawi in Medina, and second, Masjid al-Haram in Mecca. It's the most holiest places for Muslims. Since Saudi Arabia is the largest world for oil reserve, and also the sixth largest reserve for natural gas, it's have given Saudi Arabia a regional balance in the Arabian Peninsula, because it's have power like oil oil also like oil relations with countries. So it gives Saudi Arabia a regional balance, a regional power in the Arabian Peninsula. For Saudi foreign relations, it's always a non-aligned state. It maintains cooperative relationship with countries that have oil relationship. It's always not allied state. Saudi Arabia always focus on defending its position as a country which have power in the Arabian Peninsula. And it's always promote solidarity for among governments that have Islamic backgrounds. Which leads to the Shia-Sunni conflict. Saudi Arabia itself has a Shia-Sunni conflict. Saudi Arabia is basically a Sunni country which always against Shia. We have 10% Shia in Saudi Arabia, and they are divided in different parts, like among the western side and also the eastern side. The government always try to like just go against them. Then like usually they never give them rights. If you're Shia person, you're always like behind Sunni people. So which leads us to say that what explains the clashes between Syria and Saudi Arabia like many decades before, because Al-Assad is an Alawite minority. It's a branch of Shia, so the Saudi kingdom always have gone against Syria. It's because of the fear of the Iran, Hezbollah, and Syria line. That's why Saudi Arabia was like King Abdullah was the first Arab leader to say, yeah, we go against Assad easily, because yeah, we are against Alawite minority group of Shia, and which helped the Saudi to maintain regional power, because, as I said, they are rival of the Syrian government for many years. For the Saudi efforts in Syria, as General Hayden said, yes, like Prince Bandar, they changed it, they like replace him now with Prince Mohammed bin Naif. He is the Interior Minister, because Prince Bandar was a little bit reckless with the file of Syria in Saudi Arabia. Also, Saudi Arabia, along with Qatar and Turkey, is the largest provider of arms, weapons, training, and diplomatic support, as for Prince Mohammed bin Naif. For the arms, they're using Yugoslavian-made arm-made, which Saudi Arabia denies that. Like many reporters saw Islamics, terrorists like the ISIS groups, people using Yugoslavian-made arms, and again, Saudi Arabia says no. Like we didn't. Our goal was not to lead the guns to be in the hands of terrorists, but that was happened. And the arms and the training also go through Jordan and Turkey. Saudi interest in Syria is all because they want to break the alliance between Syria, Iran, and Hezbollah, because they have always been together, and Saudi Arabia have always feared that they all come together and go against Sunni states. It's also because Saudi Arabia wants to contain the unrest before it reaches its own territory, because Saudi Arabia like wants stability, and they don't want what happens in what already happened in the Arab Spring to reach Saudi Arabia. So that's why they are helping the rebels in Syria. And also ensuring that Iran does not benefit from any changes in the regional balance of power, because, for example, if the worst outcome for Saudi Arabia is that if Assad wins, he will maintain Shiite power, and that will lead Iran to be more powerful in the region, and also along with Hezbollah, which will like be the worst outcome for Saudi Arabia. The best outcome for Saudi Arabia is having a friendly Sunni government, which we don't know. I don't think that will happen, but yeah, we'll see. That's it for me.
The historic difference between the Sunnis and the Shiites has been on these who was going to be the successor of the Caliph after the death of Muhammad. Is that still the principal difference of animosity between the Shiites and the Sunnis today?
Absolutely, yeah, until today.
It hasn't manifested itself into something bigger?
No, that's the principle, yeah.
Do the Saudis, government, they worry about Iran's, some of the leaders' messianic type views of Iran being the world regional empire, or they view it more of a political threat?
No, as a political threat, of course. Any other questions?
What is how does the general Saudi public view the Shia?
The public will some of the public, like if you're really religious, very extreme religious, you will hate them totally. But if you like open-minded, a little bit like you have traveled, you have come outside, you will like be friendly with them. But most people know. Yeah, they view them like they're against us.
And in Saudi Arabia, during the Shura, I noticed that Saudi National Guard. Talk a bit about that. That gives you some idea, class, about the Sunni-Shia divide and how the Sunni powers on the Arabian Peninsula view the Shia insurgent movement or the Shia movements in Syria. So talk about a Shura in Saudi Arabia.
Well, it's like the Permanent Council in Saudi Arabia, which we have now you want me to talk about like they're gaining down some Shia members? We have now like small. That's for the first time it's happened. We have Shia members like engaging in the parliament, it's the council in Saudi Arabia. Like maybe before 2 years it was impossible, but now it's possible. But at the same time, it shows like Saudi Arabia still have conflicts with Shia because they never hear them, they never give them the right to speak. So,
yeah. And Saudi Arabia champions the causes of the Sunni throughout the world.
Yeah.
Private sector as well as the public.
Yeah.
That's important to remember too.
Yeah.
So one of the major force multipliers of the Sunni insurgent movement in Syria, of course, is transnational support. Saudi Arabia recently purchased several thousand anti-tank missiles and anti-aircraft missiles.
M79 and M60.
And but the United States has diplomatically convinced Saudi Arabia not to provide those to the Sunni insurgents. They want to. Since they purchased them from us, we do have some control in terms of re-export of that military technology. So Saudi Arabia can be a game changer in Syria. Thank you.
Thank you.
Next we have Rob. Very interesting experience and background, being the last military attaché in Damascus. Rob has a lot of good insights and information prior to the more or less insurgent movements created the current conflict.
Going to fail being a proper military officer with a PowerPoint presentation here, but we can just use this map. As Professor Self said, Colonel Rob Friedenberg, I'm an active duty military officer and serve currently on the Joint Staff, but I last served overseas as the defense attaché in Damascus between 2009 and 2011. So I was there just as the crisis in Syria began. Unlike Dan, I did my best to get PNG'd from Syria, but I was never able to do so. I stayed, although I was threatened a couple times. What I'm going to do real quickly, I think the political opposition is going to be covered by a separate speaker, but I'm going to cover that very briefly and talk a little bit about the armed opposition, and then sort of conclude with a few remarks about where I think this is going. The conflict in Syria started out, and there's always been an opposition in Syria that has been pretty brutally put down by the Syrian government for years. In fact, in 1982, there was a revolt in a town called Hama, and it was basically the entire town was leveled by Bashar's father, Hafiz al-Assad, and put down. It was a sort of Islamist insurgency. So there's always been an opposition, and after that there was a political opposition, but they were mostly controlled, and if they got too loud, they were jailed. When the Arab Spring started in Tunisia and then spread to Libya and then spread to Egypt, everyone looked at Syria to see what's going to happen there. Is it going to spread to Syria? And the Syrian internal security apparatus is pretty good. They know who the potential people are that could cause this an opposition, and they kept a pretty tight lid for a while. But inevitably, things sort of spread and happened, and the opposition started to gain some traction. But it started out as basically a series of demonstrations, peaceful demonstrations, and they happened on Fridays. You would go out and watch these things. The reason it happened on Fridays was because that was the holy day for Islam, and people could go to the mosque, and the government couldn't stop people from going to the mosque. That was their right. So that was the place they could gather. And when the mosque let out afternoon prayers, they would begin to demonstrate. And it was, as I said, it was mostly peaceful. And it began. I've written a little bit. Forgive me if I'm reading from a paper, but I want to cover this. The opposition began as these individual local coordination committees. That was how they were organized. They were very localized. They were in different parts of the country. They didn't necessarily talk to each other because the government kept such a tight rein on them. But they did coordinate with each other through the internet. The initial political demand of the opposition amounted to the fall of the regime. What the people would chant, "Ashab yurid asqat al-nidam," which means we want the fall of the regime. The people want the fall of the regime. That was sort of the motto, and it was taken from other countries that were also opposing their regimes. There was little consensus as to what actually they wanted aside from that. It all was very localized. As the uprising wore on, external opposition began to organize outside of the country. And it was composed of the people who had for years been opposed to the regime but were forced to be in exile in places like Paris or London or the United States. And it was influenced by members of this traditional intellectual elite opposition, men like Michel Kilo and Haytham al-Malek, who were sort of the grandfathers of the opposition against Assad. And they'd spent time in prison. The role of the external opposition was to articulate the internal opposition's demands and advocate and gain support from the international community. The current political opposition is now called the National Coalition of Syrian Revolutionary and Opposition Forces, short named the Syrian National Coalition. And it was begun in November 2012 by a man named Riyad Saif. And it replaced the previous Syrian National Council, which was the earliest external political organization, but it lost a lot of legitimacy due to a lot of internal squabbling. A lot of these people just couldn't agree with each other on what they wanted to do or how they wanted to organize. The National Coalition is the group which sent representatives to Geneva in the last few weeks, and is currently led by a man named Ahmed Jarba. And its main backers are the London 11, which is a group of nations, including the United States, which organized to support political opposition and advocate for a political transition. It's also, as previously stated, supported by regional players such as Saudi Arabia and Qatar. It's guided by the Geneva Communique, which was a demand for the formal transition of government from Bashar al-Assad to a transitional government. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about the armed opposition, which is going on inside Syria. A real smart person who analyzes this said, looking at the armed opposition in Syria is a little bit like looking at a kaleidoscope. It's constantly changing. It's very difficult to pin down. There's opposition. It's, again, like the political opposition inside Syria, it's very localized, and alliances transfer almost weekly. depending on how things are going on the ground. Initially, as I said, the protests were peaceful, but when the Syrian government decided to go after the protests with violence, which they did, local militias formed to protect the protesters, and basically had arms and would do what they could to stop the arrests or the beatings of the protesters. That was, and these local militias sort of transformed into what became the Syrian Military Council. And it organized it in around the summer of 2011 was when the armed opposition really got going. It originated as little more than a brand name. The Syrian military, the Syrian Free Syrian Army, excuse me, was little more than a brand name, which was led by people outside of the country. But it was used as an umbrella organization over this group of militias. After the transition, after the demonstrations were going on for a little while, and the regime became more and more violent, these militias transferred their operations from just defending protests to actually offensive operations. And what they would do is because they were so localized and didn't have a lot of coordination, they'd go after soft Syrian military targets, such as convoys or checkpoints, and just kill whoever they could from the Syrian military, just to do some kind of opposition, some kind of military opposition. There was very little coordination, as I said. Even some places like Hama or Homs or Damascus, on either side of a town, there wouldn't be a lot of coordination between these militias. The leadership of this Free Syrian Army was composed of defective officers who had escaped to Turkey. And they made videos proclaiming their defections and denounced the government. But they didn't have a lot of control operationally from outside of the country on what was going inside. They were more like sort of spokesmen. They didn't really direct operations. Some of the leadership has moved, though, from refugee camps in Turkey and is operating inside Syria itself, and that's increasing their legitimacy because they're actually with the people who are fighting the regime, not outside, just making videos. At the beginning of the conflict, weapons were obtained by black market dealers in Lebanon and Iraq. But as also was previously stated, the Gulf Arab states are now starting to fund a lot of these organizations. After several unsuccessful attempts to increase cohesiveness, a new command structure was formed in December of 2012. Rebel leaders from across Syria announced the formation of a new organization called the Supreme Joint Military Command Council, or the Supreme Military Command. The announcement was, as I said, was made in Turkey, and 260 rebel commanders got together to agree on this. It's a more operationally focused group, which is actually trying to control what's going on the ground inside Syria and coordinate these various different organizations. But the ability of this organization to actually gain some kind of military advantage over the Syrian army is really hindered because a lot of these people are fighting amongst themselves, and as we've seen, some of them are fighting each other rather than fighting the Syrian military. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about the Islamist elements. ISIS was mentioned in a previous, from a previous question. The Islamist element within the armed opposition has grown much more than it was, say, 2 years ago. And now it controls actually some areas of eastern Syria. The town of Hasaka is controlled by this Islamist organization and is completely kicked out of the Syrian government. Early on in the uprising, the Syrian government was trying to portray their own narrative of the rebellion as an Islamist uprising, even when it really wasn't. The earliest people they were certainly religious, because people in Syria tend to be religious Sunnis, but they weren't extremist. And so, but the Syrian government had an interest in making them all seem like terrorists, because that would gain support from them internationally if they looked like they were fighting terrorists. So government briefings repeatedly highlighted the speeches and interviews of a man named Sheikh Adnan al-Arur, who was a Salafist Syrian cleric born in Homs, but he would make speeches from where he was living in Saudi Arabia, and threatening the Alawites who controlled the government, who were the minority in Syria, from his exile. it's become apparent that some of these more Islamist units that are in the militias that are fighting in the armed opposition have gained reputations as being some of the better fighters. They're better armed, in some cases they're better trained, because some of them have a lot of experience in other places like Afghanistan. Jabhat al-Nusra, or the Nusra Front, is an al-Qaeda-linked group which the U.S. recently listed as a terrorist organization. The Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, or ISIS, had been an al-Qaeda-linked group, which has since been expelled by al-Qaeda Central, Ayman al-Zawahiri, because of their actually really brutal techniques against Syrian civilians. Even al-Qaeda said they were too brutal to deal with. ISIS brutality and overreach has caused a backlash against it in eastern Syria, and it's currently having to fight people that it had controlled in these places, such as Deir ez-Zor and Hasaka. There are other foreign fighters coming from Syria outside to help overthrow the Assad regime. Training camps in Lebanon's Bekaa Valley have prepared young Sunni Lebanese to join the fight, and these camps were organized in 2008 to train the Sunni militants to fight Hezbollah. And as was previously stated, the Lebanese Hezbollah, which is a Party of God, a militia inside Lebanon, which has since become actually a political organization, has sent fighters to assist Assad to fight these the Sunni insurgents inside Syria. Media reporting indicates a sizable number of other foreign fighters have come in to take part in the fighting, including Chechens, North Africans, and Gulf Arabs. The Islamist elements of the armed opposition received material support from the Gulf, as was stated, but I think it's important to note that it's not just the governments that are supporting them. It's wealthy individuals inside the Gulf who are also sending weapons to the fighters. I just want to close with a sort of a perspective I have of this conflict. People often ask, how long is this going to last? I think the time I was there really led me to believe that this is, on both sides, really an existential fight. Neither side believes it can lose because it's going to be annihilated. From the beginning of March in 2011, when the leaders of the regime saw the crisis, they looked at it through a sectarian lens. The demonstrators, although in reality, initially they were just citizens demanding reform, the regime viewed them as malevolent Salafist Sunni extremists who threatened the delicate balance, the sectarian balance inside Syria, and wanted to create anti-Alawi hostility among the rest of the population of Syria. The witnesses to anti-regime demonstrations reported hearing a chant, Al-Alawi ala Tabut wal Masihi ala Beirut, which means the Alawis to the grave and the Christians to Beirut. They'd kick out all the Christians and they'd kill all the Alawis. And that scared the heck out of these, the government, mostly Alawi government people, because they believed if they lost, they were going to die. Between June of 2011 and September, actually December, just before I left, the Syrian Ministry of Defense invited the attaché corps to a series of briefings, and we'd go sit and listen to a Syrian brigadier general talk about what he called the reality of events, what was actually going on inside Syria, which was contrary to what the media, he thought the Western media was portraying. And he showed us pretty graphic films of Syrian military officers and policemen who had been captured, being executed by people in black uniforms with masks, yelling, Salafist slogans or saying Allahu Akbar, God is great, to try to show us that this was a Salafist extremist insurgency. The video footage could have been from anywhere. We had no idea where it was coming from. It could have been from Iraq in 2004. But what you could see was this general up on the podium talking believed that it was in Syria. And he believed that he and his comrades in the Alawi-dominated Syrian military were in a fight for their lives. And even if President Bashar got on a plane tomorrow to Moscow and to live in exile, he didn't have a seat on that plane. And so I think the thing to really emphasize is that the core of the Alawi government security officials are in a fight for their lives, and political transition is not going to be an option. So I think that's just something to think about. On the other side, a lot of the people who have been fighting the Syrian regime inside the these towns believe they can never go back either. So I've likened this war. I don't like to make light of it because it's such a violent and terrible situation, but it's a lot like a Quentin Tarantino movie. You've just got two forces that are just heading towards each other, and you know it's just going to get more and more violent, and I think it'll probably last a long time. So that's my briefing, and if there's any questions, I'd be happy to take. Yes.
How profound do you think the impact would be of, say, the two largest rebel blocs on the ground, the Islamic Front and the Syrian Revolutionary Front, join forces? I know it's far-fetched, but if there was some cohesiveness, would that change the reality on the ground?
I think any increase in cohesion would help the opposition win. When you talk about the opposition, though, you know there's lots of different groups. Syria is very fragmented, so when you speak of the opposition, you have to be careful because there's so many different groups fighting. But the one thing that is an advantage for the Syrian government right now is that the opposition is not cohesive. So any increase in cohesion is going to be an advantage to the opposition. Yes.
If one side or the other, let's say either the Syrian government side or the rebel side, actually got incredibly close to being defeated, would their supporters actually militarily intervene, let's say Saudi Arabia, or on the case of the Syrian government, Russia?
I think what would happen is they would just double down on what they're doing already. I don't think you'd ever see Russian. I mean, there are Russians inside Syria who are advisors to the Syrian military. I don't think the Russians are ever going to go in with, the Russian army. But what they're going to do is increase their support. The Iranians. You look at the newspaper. There's Iranians inside Syria fighting, and Lebanese Hezbollah. They're going to use proxies to assist their side. The Saudis are going to do the same thing, and the other Arabs. They're going to use what they're doing now and just increase it. And I think on either side, the Iranians on one side and the Russians to a certain extent, and the Saudis on the other side, or the other Gulf states, they don't think they can lose either. The Saudis can't tolerate Bashar al-Assad surviving because he's a sworn enemy, because they're basically at war. So I think they'll just continue to do what they're doing and increase what's going on. Yes.
Can you comment a little bit on the refugee situation? That is.
Well, if you look at the map, and I can. This is publicly available. It's from USAID. The refugee situation is horrendous. It was said before. There's a huge number of refugees have gone into Lebanon. If you look in the south, at the very bottom, there's a place. There's these little arrows are the refugee camps in Jordan. The Zatri refugee camp in Jordan is the third largest city in Jordan right now. Jordan is a country that has very little natural resources and not a lot of water, and they're pouring resources with help from the United States and others into this camp because they have no other choice. And it's in Jordan. It's really affecting the demographic balance. Jordan has gone through three different waves of refugees: Palestinians, Iraqis, and now Syrians. So it's really caused a lot of problems. Lebanon's the same way. This is becoming a regional conflict because the backers of the Syrian regime inside Lebanon are starting to get into the fight as well. But the refugees and Turkey, which is probably better suited to handle refugees because it's got more money and better infrastructure, is still having a lot of problems. But the refugee situation is horrible. And internally displaced persons, people inside Syria have, the Syrian government is using hunger basically as a weapon, and they're blockading cities and not letting any aid inside. So it's a real humanitarian disaster, and General Hayden has it right. That's something the U.S. administration is really struggling with, because the more and more you see this covered on the media, the more and more people say there's something needs to be done. Yes.
So since this is primarily tribal-based as well as people-based, because the Kurds are holding their own in their own territory in the northeast, do you think this could grow to the scale of something on the so-called African World War in the early 2000s and late 90s?
Well, I think it's becoming a regional war. I mean, it potentially could, but it's a proxy war right now. I don't think, again, that governments are going to actually send their own troops in to fight. They're going to continue to do what they're doing, but it's spreading. Terrorism. There's bombs going off in Lebanon because of what's going on in Syria. So I think it's spreading and it's getting worse, and it's going to continue to do so. It'll be a kind of a low-level violence. I don't think the army's in the field, but it's become a regional war now. Yes.
Where's the U.S. in this? I mean, according to Hayden, we're kind of rooting for the Sunnis to zap Iran, but you want stability, but you're not really sure if you want Assad. So where do we kind of sit on this? And is there any scenario at any point where we would actually become not just sitting on the side watching?
U.S. policy, official U.S. policy right now, and I say this as an active duty Army officer, so that's what it is to effect a political transition. That's why we're supporting the Geneva II talks, the London 11 effort, and the Geneva communique. So we want a political transition. We want both sides to come to the table and figure out a way to stop fighting each other and come to some kind of agreement. More weapons, more increased military efforts right now, according to official policy, are going to get more people killed. So we want to see a political transition. We want to do what we can to help the humanitarian situation. The U.S. is doing things. The USAID is participating. It's obviously very difficult to get into the places that really need help. But right now, the U.S. official policy is political transition. Yes?
But do you think there is a political transition over there? I don't think so at all, like maybe for over 20 years to come. And there is no hope at all. And the people who's dying there, especially in the Yarmouk refugee camp, and without any aid, there's the people who can be dying.
It's a very, very difficult situation, and it's heartbreaking. I completely agree with you. I've driven through Yarmouk camp before all this happened. It's a terrible situation. But the U.S. right now is the policy is political transition, and that's what we're doing.
Realistic? Is it realistic solution to be like that?
Yeah, she is. Looking at the other options, what the other options are, I think it's possibly as realistic as the other ones, but it's going to take a lot. It's going to take a long time because the two sides are very far apart.
In the war in Syria, there's a sponge for extremists that just sucks them all in, and they just kill each other there. So it suits a purpose for the West.
Well, it does if you look at it that way, and this has been something that people have said. You can say that it suits our purpose to have the extremists on either side killing each other. But the problem with that argument is that it also is causing our allies, who are neighbors like Lebanon and Turkey and Jordan, a whole lot of problems. So you can try to contain it, but it's not really being contained. So the worse this gets, the harder it's going to be on some countries that really are hard pressed to have stability in their own countries, and that is not a good news. So I think it's more in our interest to get these things solved.
Great. Thank you, Rob. Rob understands insurgencies very well. He was a Special Forces officer for several years. And I think when you look at the situation in Syria, the conflict, our foreign policy, Saudi Arabia has far more influence in this region than the United States. Far more. So we want to look at policy initiatives, what's going on. If the Saudi Arabian influence grows, then their objective, of course, is removal of Saudi. Nevertheless, when we look at influence in the region, Saudi Arabia and Iran are key players. And right now, our diplomatic efforts to reduce the flow of military technology to Syrian opposition forces, because that just simply accelerates the conflict and generates even more Cold War kind of confrontation. Next, we will hear from an individual who understands Syrian politics very well, Danny. Well, what is the real political situation inside Syria? Next, we will hear from a professor from Old Dominion University, and they have a seminar program focusing on the Arab Spring, and he would like to brief everybody on that issue, Dr. Ziegler, and to invite you to Old Dominion University in Richmond for their seminar after Danny, and then we'll go to lunch.
Hello, everyone, and first, thanks to all the speakers and Dr. Self for arranging this, and of course the sign language interpreters. When Dr. Self organized this, we were on the brink of Geneva II, so everyone thought that there was going to be some breakthrough. Nothing happened other than some photo ops, and Secretary Kerry delivered another passionate speech, and the opposition making false promises to the people inside of Syria. And more importantly, there's certain reasons why a political transition can't take place right now. It's more than just the opposition and the regime fighting. There's more variables to that, and we'll try and go into depth in the little time that we have. So one of the biggest reasons why it's going to be very tough for a political transition to take place is because there's so many people benefiting financially from what's going on in Syria, especially Russia, the regime, and the rebels. We talked about Russia selling arms to Syria. Some of the contracts have been delayed, but nonetheless, there still are long-term financial guarantees and benefits for Russia. And rebels, interestingly, buy most of their arms from corrupt ranks in the Syrian army. So there's corrupt people in the Syrian army that have made millions from arms sales, and they obviously don't want to forego that opportunity. And rebels have taken control of some key oil fields. Syria does have some oil, and they, in fact, sell that oil to areas that are under control of the regime. So that's obviously a cash cow for them. And then ransom. They kidnap people at large, ask for high ransoms, and on many occasions they do collect. So a lot of people are making money. The Free Syrian Army has acknowledged that the rebels are profiteering from reselling everything, from weapons to humanitarian aid. Some rebel commanders are very wealthy, especially the Islamists, the ISIS movement. I mean, it's hard to believe everything you see on the internet, but I've seen videos of ISIS commanders driving BMWs, Mercedes, living in villas, and enjoying life. So these are all very strong considerations to make. Money is very important in this case. And then another major consideration is that the Syrian army has become so corrupt, so financially corrupt, to the point that many people that actually oppose the opposition and fear the opposition taking over actually join local militias instead of the Syrian army, because they believe that it's infiltrated with double agents and rebels. And then another reason why it's going to be very tough for a political transition to take place is because there's many divisions within the loyalist camp. And when we talk about the loyalist camp, we talk about all parties that oppose the opposition from coming into power, the so-called opposition. And there's obviously lawlessness in Syria, and that enables certain people to act at whim. You have intelligence and high-ranking military officers. They can act at their own discretion, but they have not attempted a coup. They haven't attempted to take over power because they get their money from the regime. Still, Iran, Russia, they deal exclusively with the regime. That's who they provide money and arms to. I know everyone probably heard about the case of the British surgeon that was operating inside of Syria, Abbas Khan. He actually was detained by the authorities, and he was granted a pardon by Assad himself, but he was killed, or the regime said he committed suicide shortly before he was supposed to be released. And there was reports that it was actually military officers, intelligence officers, that ordered people in the prison to execute him. So there's a case of people going outside the lines, acting at their own discretion. without the discretion of the president. You have very strong local militias. You have the local committees, the National Defense Forces, and they do receive money and support from the regime. And I do believe that even if the regime did call for some greater ceasefire in certain areas, these hardcore extreme elements would not abide to a ceasefire because they do not want to deal with anyone on the other side at all costs. And then something else to consider is that going into Geneva, we were told that the regime was sending a delegation, but that was a lame duck delegation. You didn't see any military generals, any intelligence officers that could have made decisions or are influential in making decisions. So it was more or less a show delegation. So within the ranks of the loyalists, there are definitely some divisions and misunderstandings. Of course, we've talked about the divisions among the rebels. This is what they talk about in the news all the time. We've talked about it here. And the rebels themselves, political and military, are leading to more divisions and lack of unity. And this is hindering the opposition from coming together and saying we want to form a unified front and push for a political solution. The Syrian National Coalition, we just discussed this group. Now they're really in hot water with the other members of the opposition. Going into Geneva, the chief of the SNC, Ahmed Jalba, he said, you know, Geneva is going to be a graveyard for al-Assad. And what happened? Nothing came out of it. So that really was a big problem for many people, and it still is. And the SNC recently sacked the well-respected top commander of the Free Syrian Army, Salim Idris. And people on the ground have said, we're going against that. We don't agree with this decision. We're still loyal to Idris. So the SNC is really being viewed now as a power-hungry puppet of other states. Many rebel factions are at odds. They're split about how the new Syria will look, if there's ever a new Syria. And then, of course, you have the foreign rebels that we've discussed. Hezbollah, Iran, and the regime likes to call them takfiris, people that want to annihilate and decimate the so-called infidels, the Shias and the Alawis, Ismailis. But from what we know, these rebels, at bare minimum, are enabled by the regime. Meaning, when the regime drops barrel bombs, they drop them on civilians, not on ISIS or Jabhat al-Nusra. And what's important to keep in mind about the SNC is that they keep getting false promises from London 11, from their allies that this is going to end, they're going to support them, and this compels them to hoard power and to really isolate other people in opposition that can make a difference. And then a great problem that we have is that there's two major rebel factions that we know of. There's many, there's hundreds, but the two largest groups that have brought militias together are the Syrian Revolutionary Front and the Islamic Front. Between the two groups, we can estimate that they have about 100,000 troops, weapons, and if these two groups came together, then they could really make a change on the ground. Many feel that way. And really, again, the extreme hardline militants, ISIS, they're really, really doing their best to also keep the opposition, the moderate opposition, from coming into power. And there's some people that believe that there could be some cooperation between ISIS and the regime. There's reports of the regime releasing some Islamists from jail, some ISIS activists, and there's been rumors of ISIS secretly selling resources to the regime, oil, namely. And again, the regime hasn't dropped barrel bombs on ISIS strongholds or really went hard and ferocious at these so-called extremists. Of course, the foreign powers are divided about how to move forward politically. Hezbollah, Russia, and Iran continue to prop the regime with arms, money, and advisors. So Assad has no reason to negotiate because there's no major threat on the ground. If the rebels did obtain some sophisticated weaponry, then there would be more incentive to negotiate, but I think even at that point, he'd fight the last bullet. The Shia fighters, we talked about the infantry and how there's lack of for the regime. Many defectors have went to the opposition. So on the ground, the regime is relying on Hezbollah, Iranian paramilitary fighters, and Iraqi Shia fighters. They're very dedicated, they're fervent, and they will fight to the death, and they have a lot of experience elsewhere. So obviously this is complicating the situation and giving the regime and the people that matter less incentive to go to the negotiating table. So again, there are enough fighters from outside that support the regime to keep this conflict going on and to keep the regime afloat militarily. The GCC states, the Gulf Cooperation Council, minus Oman, which has a lot of Shiites, and they're very sympathetic to a certain degree to the regime. Turkey and some Western nations provide the opposition with just enough support, and again, it's just enough support to keep the stalemate going. We understand that the Saudi royal family supports the opposition, but at the same time, everyone is thinking, you know, what to do next. They know that they can give the opposition that push to advance on Syrian positions, especially in and around Damascus, but they don't know what to do next. So they're just feeding them with enough supplies to keep them from completely falling until they figure out a plan B. Moving forward, what's next? It's really hard to say. I think we all agree that this is going to continue to go on. I think the regime will only negotiate if the rebels acquire sophisticated weaponry and threaten their strongholds. And again, they would negotiate in fragments. And right now they're using the nuclear portfolio as a crutch. They're saying, you know, we still have these nuclear weapons, we can't move them out of the country, so we really can't do anything until we get these nuclear weapons out. And they're going to continue to allow the weapons to trickle out instead of move out quickly so they can keep going on. If the regime does begin to erode from within, I think that Russia may begin talking to other powerful minority figureheads that are in the country and also acceptable to some loyalists, moderate rebels from Russia and Iran in the West. Again, there are some people in the regime that maybe want to defect or don't completely agree with the direction of the regime, and they want a political solution. But there's really a lot of control, and it's impossible for these people to defect. If they do defect, the regime might kidnap their families, throw them in jail. So the regime is doing a great job of holding on to its inner circle with force and threats and intimidation. I think that the last hope for preventing a prolonged and protracted conflict is a coup from within. And I think that if the rebels begin to threaten the Damascus security belt and the areas around the coast, then you might see people from within the regime, other Alawi say, you know, we feel like we have to talk, we want a way out. Again, they can't get on the plane to Russia, so we have to start talking to these people, and let's try and all come together and see if we can figure something out. But again, the likelihood of that is very slim at this point. Something to keep in mind is that Assad's strategy right now is to move all the refugees out of Syria. They don't want any internal displacement. They want to move as many people outside of Syria as they can, because the belief is many refugees are probably not sympathetic to the regime because the regime has destroyed their homes with barrel bombs, scuds, whatever it is. So they feel like if they move enough people outside of the country, maybe at some point they can start from scratch. And the greatest hope for some is that the rebels will acquire anti-aircraft weapons to disable the Syrian Air Force, and that would be a major game changer. And I know this is kind of off the topic, but we haven't talked about this. A lot of people have died, and you know we're hearing more and more that there's no light at the end of the tunnel for Syrians, for Libyans, for Yemenis, for Egyptians. But it's very important to note that the barrier of fear of a particular leader, their family, or political party has eroded. People have sacrificed their lives. 140,000 alone in Syria, and that's what's documented. Hundreds in Egypt, hundreds in Yemen, for the sake of some freedom and for some change. And I think that as a result of the Arab Spring, no cult of personality will ever be able to rise in the Middle East again. People are disgruntled and they're sick of worshiping a person or worshiping their family or worshiping certain symbols. People in Syria and Yemen and Egypt and Bahrain, everywhere, they want to do the things that people in the civilized world do: learn, study, go to school, work, and live normal lives. People are sick of being politicized. And really, before the Arab Spring, there was no light at the end of the tunnel. We thought that dictatorship would live on forever, tyranny would live on forever. But now that the people have spoken, it looks like at some point there could be light at the end of the tunnel. No one ever thought, even Assad himself thought, that people could rise up. About 2 months before the uprising began in Syria, a reporter asked Assad if he thought that the uprising would come to Syria, and he confidently said that his people would never turn against him because he's in tune with what they believe in and he supports the Palestinian cause. And what happened a few months later, people actually took to the streets, not to call for a takfiri state, but to ask for simple freedoms. So we hope, for the best for these people. And that's it. Any questions? Yes.
Do you think a balkanization of Syria is a possibility, split into many little states and spheres of influences?
That is a very good question. I don't think at any point Syria is going to split completely. You do have a strong Kurdish presence now, and they've really formed their own autonomous area with their own governance. And again, it was important to note earlier that these are all man-made states by the Europeans. So it's possible at some point that people could contemplate the idea of splitting, but I think you might see a federal system where each region has more rights. But I don't think that people want to divide, because the Syrian people especially are very nationalistic. And they've never been too extreme from the standpoint of religion, but regardless of what the regime has done to them, Syrians are proud to be Syrian, first and foremost. And I don't think that there's any Syrians that want to see Syria disintegrate, whether it's Alawi or it's Shia, or it doesn't matter what sect. These people have lived together, lived amongst one another in the same towns, villages, and I think that it's political groups and parties that have split them. It's not the will of the people. So I think at some point, you'll see the country come together. Maybe there'll be some, federal arrangement. Yes?
But even with the federal arrangement, we had that in Iraq, and it's fallen apart. Wouldn't that also be very much possible in Syria? Because people fight along religious and tribal alignments rather than via parties, and the federal system probably wouldn't work in Syria because of that, or at least it might work for a while, and then we'd see Iraq again, failed state.
That's a very good observation, and I'm glad we have the opportunity to compare the two. The Iraqi model is a little bit different because we had a larger power go in and dictate how the new Iraq would look. You had the United States and other powers put certain people in power, and the people that came to power in Iraq weren't even in Iraq before. So we have not so nationalistic leaders in Iraq that are not serving for the greater interest. You have corruption everywhere, but I think that the Iraqi leaders right now, they first think 95% about themselves and their clan or their tribe or their town before they think about the greater Iraq. So I think that's what happened there, a lot of greed. But I think in Syria, if federalism, cooperation is brought about by Syrians themselves, as opposed to a foreign power dictating exactly what a new Syria will look like, the shape and the scope of the government, the model may be a little bit stronger. But the Iraq example, I think, is a little bit different because you had a Sunni majority leading, but even when the Sunni majority was leading, you had all sects, ethnicities oppressed by the same person. but one group or one party was interjected into power. But I think in the new Syria, you'll have people coming together and trying to share. Of course, there's going to be differences, but I think that there could be some success as long as one party, be it Saudi Arabia, Iran, whoever, doesn't come in and say, this is who we want, this is who's going to lead, and this is who's going to dictate how the new Syria looks.
Thank you. Federal system, a strong federal system in Syria as an alternative to balkanization. Dr. Ziegler? Take the floor.
Before you go, my name is Don Ziegler. I'm the geographer at Old Dominion University. And since many of you are interested in Syria and the Middle East and the Islamic world, I invite you to Old Dominion University, our Virginia Beach campus, on March 28th to the 30th. The group that's meeting there is the Southeast Regional Middle East and Islamic Studies Seminar. We're holding a meeting that begins on Friday, really Saturday morning, and it is about the Middle East. And we have a panel on Saturday afternoon on the Syrian crisis that will feature Rochelle Davis, Curtis Ryan, Chris Tonsing, and they'll be talking and going over many of the same things that you heard about here, but maybe from a different perspective. So if you'd like to find out more about our conference, I brought some programs with me. I'd be happy to give you one.
Give it to me. We'll post it on the Geography
it.
Department's website, and it'll be available to those who will be of interest.
Here's one for Burl. It'll go on the website, and I have a few more left. And I invite you to Virginia Beach in the spring, in March. $79 hotel rates, a quality inn if you're coming down for the weekend.
Right. Thank you, Doc. Everybody ready to go eat? The way we're going to work this is that they have my credit card number. I bought chow for 40 people. We'll have more than that. Some of you may have your meal card. That's not a problem. Just tell them and I'll be there, tell them that you're with the Syrian Holocaust seminar. And we'll go eat and we'll reconvene here. It's what time? 12:42. We'll reconvene here at 1:30. Everybody has plenty of time to eat. So, Southside Dining, go out into the building, turn to the right, and you can see it. This is not a secure area, so no